Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and it is a privilege to serve as your host and moderator for tonight's formal debate between Fro from the Pale Galilean and Francis from TurretinFan on the question, is the Roman Catholic priesthood valid? This is a Saturday night showdown between a Catholic and a Protestant. Fro taking the affirmative for tonight, and T-Fan taking the negative. Gentlemen, I'm excited to see what you both are going to bring to the table in terms of points and arguments. It's been a while, I think, since we've hosted a debate on this resolution or a resolution similar, so this should be good. Let's get acquainted, though. Break the ice a little bit before we get into our opening statements and the debate itself. Fro, you're no stranger to debates, nor are you a stranger to Standing for Truth, but it has been a little while since you've been here. So, Fro, how have you been? And also tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm doing very well. I just go by Fro. I run a channel called the Pale Galilean, kind of exploring the theological and intellectual side of the Catholic faith. And I'm hoping to do that here. Before we begin, just to get some a little house cleaning out of the way, am I allowed to stream this to my channel, Donnie?
Absolutely. If you gentlemen would like to simulcast, go right ahead. No problem with that.
Okay, thank you. So thank you kindly. But yeah, I just run a channel, Pale Galilean. I kind of do some kind of freelance writing, just as a hobby, and that's really all I got to say right now.
Okay, well, Fro, I've got your channel linked in the description box for people to see if they want to see more from you. Okay, Fro, thanks for being here. Thank you for the intro. T-Fan, it's my pleasure. T-Fan, you've been here about 500 times, and so I appreciate you being willing to hang out with me so frequently over the years. So T-Fan, tell us, how have you been since the last time you were here, and tell us a little bit about yourself for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are.
Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be back again. I'm a Reformed blogger and now I guess also YouTuber, and I have been doing these kind of debates for a while. I think in the next few weeks, or within the next essentially calendar week, there's this debate, and then 2 more times I'll be here on Standing for Truth. So it'll be a week of debates for me. But I'm looking forward to tonight's debate with Fro. We've had a debate before. People can go back and check out our previous debates. And anyway, looking forward to this evening. I've debated on lots of other topics, not just me and Fro back and forth over and over again. but I'm glad to have this opportunity. So I'm looking forward to it.
T-Fan, you're right. You are going to be busy. I'm looking at the schedule here. We have you for a debate with CJ Cox next week on 1 John 5:7. We've got a 2v2 that I'm looking forward to, and so are a lot of other people. Does regeneration precede faith? And so, okay, T-Fan, thank you for the intro. For those that want to see more from you, I do have your channel linked in the description box for people to check out. Please go give our guests subscriptions, show some love and support. I appreciate the time, as always, that our debaters give us, not only for the debates, but the time that it takes to prep adequately for them. Okay, let's make sure we're on the same page before we get into our opening statements by going over the format. And so what we have for tonight are 15-minute opening statements. Again, the question for anybody just joining us, is the Roman Catholic priesthood valid? Fro's taking the affirmative, therefore he will be giving the first 15 minutes, and TurretinFan takes the negative. Then we've got good comprehensive rebuttals. So rebuttals are 12 minutes each, lots of time to respond to each other's points and arguments brought up in our opening arguments. Then we jump into everybody's favorite part of these formal debates, the cross-examination. We have 50 minutes in total, broken up into 2 sessions of 25 minutes each. Then we jump into closing statements, great opportunity to wrap up our thoughts, wrap up our points, and address anything we feel has been left hanging up to that point. And then this is when we jump into our audience Q&A, and we get to hang out with you guys for roughly 25 to 30 minutes. So please, if you have an argument or a question or a challenge based on anything our guests here tonight have said or argued. Fro and TurretinFan, send those challenges in the form of questions. Please be cordial, be respectful and professional, as our debaters have been so gracious with their time. If you are going to attack arguments and not persons. And don't forget to tag me at Donny or at Standing For Truth. And that way I don't miss your questions. Super chats, as always, will be bumped to the top to guarantee that those are engaged. Okay, Fro, TurretinFan, I think we're all, including the audience, on the same page. And we are ready to go for an excellent debate here. Fro, just let me know when you'd like me to get your slides up. I can do so.
Yeah, get them up now, but I'd also just like to make a couple announcements first.
Sure, yeah. Take your time.
First of all, I just want to thank Francis for agreeing to debate me on this issue. I also want to thank Donny Budinsky for hosting it. And I want to take some time out, just a little bit, to thank some of the authors responsible for kind of helping me with these frameworks and thoughts. So the first is Dr. David Falk and his work, Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context. The second is Yahweh's Divine Images by Dr. Daniel McClellan. And the third is God in Anatomy by Dr. Francesca Stavrokopoulou. They really helped bring this together through their own research, and so I have them to thank. And with that, I think we can begin whenever you're ready, Donny.
Fro, I will start the timer right now. Go ahead.
I'm doing it myself. Okay, so first, the title of this is obviously They That Bear God's Name, the biblical vocabulary and mechanism of the Bible that makes the modern priesthood legible. And you do that by, well, comparing it to the ancient one. So first, what is a priest? Because words don't have inherent meaning as much as they mean with the definitions we give them. So here, it's a person that serves as an authorized intermediary that performs sacrifices on behalf of others, typically towards God or some other divine being, especially when you get to more Eastern religions. So what makes a priest operant is their holiness. It's the thing that actually sets them apart. And these are the passages, and there are numerous more, there are ones more than this, but this is sort of the overview that establishes the fact that the priest is holy. So in order to understand that, we need to understand, what does holiness consist of? And it usually acts in two realms. First of all is that boundary. And we're going to get back to that just in a little bit. It'll be relevant. But first is boundary, and then it's ground. First is boundary that separates you from that which is divine. And in turn, those divine agents sanctify the ground. The ground itself becomes special in relating towards holiness. And so the boundary between man and God, or the divine, and the ground that the divine sanctifies is of utmost importance. And these ideas aren't always distinct. Boundary and ground work in tandem to create this logic that we humans conceptualize universally as worship. And this is often seen in the form of idolatry. So an idol, in order to define what it is any physical media that presences divinity, that actually works to bring the divine to sanctify the ground, and therefore you have holiness in that presence. Here are just a few examples of the idols that we can identify, both in history and even from the Bible itself. And so it is there to make the difference and make the distinction between what is profane and what is sacred. And what we find out is that God is worshipped through the logic of idolatry, and a specific one that I would call sanctioned idolatry. And we'll get into that here now. So what actually is it? Well, sanctioned idolatry in biblical terms, and what we see in the Bible, is simply physical media that God himself has authorized by which to presence himself to his people. And we have a few of them today that are operant. In Islam, that is the Quran, because it is quite literally the word-for-word speech of God. And within Christianity, that's largely the Eucharist, because the true presence of Christ is there mediating. Now, I want to make a qualification. This isn't just in Abrahamic religions. The concept is universal in just the way humans articulate and interact with unseen agents and the divine, nor does it mean a single religion is going to have a single idol. Now, we see this idolatry in multiple levels. First is the ark, the standing stones, and the temple, and you have the passages here on screen. Here, what we see is a consistent pattern where God not merely is being symbolized by these things, but actually being presenced by them, where there is a very real sense where the ark, the standing stones, and the temple actually become God. That boundary between the human and the divine is blurred to such a degree that the physical media encapsulates God. The identity between the physical media and God kind of collapsed just a bit. In fact, what we see is that God communicates to Moses not just out of body, but actually from the ark, because that's how divinity was presenced. Now, what we see when this is operant is the grounding becoming sanctified and the boundary itself being established, where the idol becomes the God by which boundary is made through. And these are the examples that demonstrate that. But the ground then is how we understand things like temples and worship spaces. Now, all of these examples is in the logic of idolatry, but they are also present not just in physical media, but often through other kinds of physical media, such as independent agents. Another example of idol is kind of the divine name bearer, the idea that actually bearing the name of God on yourself meaningfully presences God to yourself, and those who are authorized to bear God's name often become like God. The examples before you on screen are all examples where people are having encounters with angelic beings, and they are portrayed as angelic beings, but then every word after the introduction just becomes God himself speaking. Now, some might say this was only symbology. Some might say these are pre-incarnate Christ. Some might make any other number of excuses and other sorts of criteria to explain this away. But the problem is that Genesis 22 actually really throws a wrench in this, because Genesis 22, we actually have two individuals that are just claiming to be men of God, messengers. And then we see in real time how these men of God go from just merely men, then to angels. Then they take on a singular substance, where Lot actually identifies them as a singular Lord. And then thereafter, they actually become what the text openly calls the Yahweh on earth and the Yahweh in heaven. And the Yahweh in heaven gives fire and brimstone to the Yahweh on earth, and that's how he smote Sodom and Gomorrah. So we see these individuals transform in real time from just people, from angelic beings, just to God, and it's through that presencing. And this gets to the crux of this issue. Priests themselves are idols in this way. Take, for instance, this Old Testament priesthood. Now pay special attention to the headband. It literally is pronounced Kodesh El Yahweh, meaning holy to Yahweh. I probably butchered the pronunciation, but still, this is relevant because it's actually bearing the divine name on the forehead. And here we actually have the times where we look at priests and they're being called the name bearers, the servants of God, Malak, which is how these guys are also presented. And so what we see is that God interacts with his people precisely through a priest being a functional idol, bearing his name into them, and thus his identity collapses into gods. Now, the Catholic priesthood is defined by two doctrines, in persona Christi and alter Christus. In persona Christi is actually when the priest acts out of sacramental roles and functions and not acting himself, but becomes the bodily agent of Jesus. Rather, the doctrine is Jesus himself is actually doing the action. Similarly, alter Christus isn't just symbolic, where we believe that the priest becomes symbolically Christ, but where the priest's identity actually collapses into Jesus's identity. And so that's why we get the term from Latin, another Christ. That's what's going on. That's the operant logic. Now, where have we seen this before? The identity and substance of the bearer are demonstrated here. Much like the way that Jesus and the priest operate, the same principle applies to the divine name bearer, where the Old Testament priests were priests because they bore God's name. The New Testament priests are priests because they bear Jesus's authority. And it is similar to how Aaron also derived his priesthood, and his sons derived their priesthood through very similar mechanisms. Now, what about the New Testament, you might ask? Oh, what about it? The New Testament evidence is enormous here. All throughout, we actually have a situation after situation where Paul clearly has this operating in the back of his mind. And so it operates on very similar assumptions. But let's look at another objection. The priesthood of all believers. This contains significant flaws. First, there are multiple passages in the Bible that already presuppose that there are priests or an office answering the same purpose exists. And they're on screen here. And the most one that I would think is the most relevant here is 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 21. But I will leave the audience to look at the rest briefly. But all this is to say, these verses have no rhetorical value if there isn't an office that at least answers the same function as priest. But priests are for the Old Testament. Okay, well, first of all, you've discovered Marcionism. Congratulations, you won something. But secondly, is that you're forced into a position where either God has changed, okay, which you can't say, or there's some significant reason where the way in which God has always decided to commune with his people has suddenly changed, where there's a significant reason where suddenly the way that God has oriented his family together has significantly changed between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so it's either a different God or God has changed, or there you might be able to invent another reason, but I don't think it's going to be a particularly good one or one that another person would want to swallow. So let me just go through some final thoughts here, because there's several directions my opponent can go to try to answer my arguments. The first, he has to deny that the sanctioned idolatry model describes the biblical worship accurately. And so to do that, he has to be able to invent or find other mechanisms by which God's presence is given amongst us and presented amongst us. That's going to be relatively hard to do, but I suppose he might have a way. Option 2, he has to provide an alternative explanation for the angel of the Lord identity collapses. And it's going to have to be something beyond the pre-incarnate Christ, because biblically there's only one pre-incarnate Christ, and that's Melchizedek. And so he's going to have to figure out another way in which to make that work. Option 3, he has to explain why the Aaronic priests follow the same logic as the angel of the Lord appearances, because you might want to claim that, bearing God's name on your forehead is ceremonial. Well, one would have to ask, why is the ceremony based on the angel of the Lord appearances when we know the angel of the Lord also carries the divine name? He'll have to deny that Paul and Jesus describes Christ's relationships to Jehovah in name-bearing terms. For various reasons, like John 17 and Philippians 2 exist, that's going to be difficult. Or option 5, he must account for the numerous New Testament texts that already presuppose a priesthood, and I've showed a few of those on screen already. But finally, and probably most importantly, he has to explain why this pattern terminates. He has to explain why God, since all the way with Jacob and his standing stones, has always mediated his presence through divine agency in physical media, how he has always done that since the standing stones of Jacob all the way to when the second temple was destroyed, because the temple was also an idol within Judaism, within Second Temple Judaism, that God's presence was occupying. And most importantly, this explanation has to come from Scripture itself. I have 45 seconds, 44 now. I will donate the rest of my time to the Q&A, well, audience Q&A.
Fro, thank you very much for the donation. That's very generous of you. To the Q&A, get those questions in. Make sure you're tagging me. I do look forward to these Q&A periods because they give us the opportunity to expand even more on the topic, because there's a lot to discuss and a lot of information, I am sure, on both sides to engage. So, Fro, thank you very much for that closing statement, or for that opening statement. And TFan, I'll reset the timer. Whenever you're ready, feel free to begin your presentation. Just make sure to unmute. The floor is yours.
There we go. All right. Thanks very much. The question tonight, is the Roman Catholic priesthood valid? My answer is that it is not, that it's an invalid priesthood. And I do look forward to rebutting some of the points that were raised in the rebuttal time period, but so many of the things won't be addressed, of course, in my opening. But here's the roadmap of what I do plan to talk about. First, I'll talk about the standard of validity, and that is, did God ordain it? And then I'm going to talk about the Old Testament precedent for this rule, namely the regulative principle of worship. Then I'm going to explain the New Testament priesthood, demonstrate that from Scripture. And then I'm offering now the explanation that the Roman Catholic priesthood mutated out of a legitimate office, the legitimate office of elder, but priest, hear us, is only ascribed either to Christ or to all Christians for New Testament Christian worship. Now, of course, it's ascribed as well to the Old Testament priests, but for the New Testament, there are no priests. There's no priesthood akin to that of the Old Testament. Now, my standard of validity is not canonical validity within Roman Catholicism. In other words, I'm not making a canon law argument that they've done something wrong, they're not properly ordaining priests or something like that. And it's not a question of the sacramental validity of the rite of ordination in view of the heresy of those ordaining or something like that. And it's not a Donatistic critique. But the question is divine warrant. Did God establish a new priesthood? And is the Roman Catholic priesthood that priesthood? Now, I didn't hear anything about God establishing a new priesthood in the affirmative, but the debate's not over. Maybe it will come out later. And then the question is the Roman Catholic, if there is one, how would we identify that it's the Roman Catholic one? And then, of course, I didn't hear any real connection to the Roman Catholic priesthood from the parts that we discussed, but we'll come back to that. Then my critique will apply with similar force to the Roman Catholic priesthood, which I'm debating today, but also would apply to other purported priesthoods like the Mormon priesthoods. The regular principle worship is this. It's set forth first in Deuteronomy 12:32. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. Thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it. In other words, we're not free to set up our own priesthood. We're not free to set up any way of worshiping God other than what God has set forth himself. However, as was highlighted, I think, in Fro's presentation, there were priests in the Old Testament. But there were also some times when this priesthood was violated in various ways, and the answer from God was a strong negative. You can't just make up your own priesthood. The first example is the strange fire of Nadab and Abihu, who were the sons of Aaron. So it's not that they were altogether not priests, but they were going beyond what was commanded. They didn't use the fire that they were supposed to use. They took strange fire, And so Leviticus 10:1-3 provides the account that they offered strange fire before the Lord, which he did not command them. Therefore there went out fire from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, this is that the Lord spake, saying, I'll be sanctified in them that come near me, and before all the people I'll be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. In other words, this was a sufficient answer to Aaron for why Aaron's sons were put to death by God. And the answer was that they did not obey the principle, the regulative principle. They did not keep themselves to worshiping God only by the way that he commanded. And another example is Korah. Now, in this case, there were sons of Levi. They were not the priests. They were not part of Aaron's family, but they were part of the larger tribe of Levi. And they wanted to offer incense as well. They brought forth censers. And I'm not going to read all the details, but it's here in Numbers 16. And what happened was that Korah and others gathered together saying, we should also be able to minister before God. But God said no. And the way that God showed that this was inappropriate was, if you read in verse 30, which is on the screen, but it says, but if the Lord make a new thing, and the earth open her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertain unto them, and they go down quick into the pit, then you shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. And all Israel that were round about them fled at the cry of them, for they said, lest the earth swallow us up also. And there came out a fire from the Lord and consumed the 250 men that offered incense. So again, another violation of the regulative principle, another severe punishment from God. In this case, an unheard of punishment of the earth swallowing them up alive, and then fire coming out again and consuming people who had violated God's law. The sin of Jeroboam is a recurring theme in the Old Testament, as the 10 tribes, by Jeroboam's provocation, were led into sin in the worship of the Lord. And the sin of Jeroboam is described in 1 Kings 12:25-33, where he took 2 golden calves, idols, and he says, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and he put the other in Dan, at the opposite ends of these 10 tribes. This thing became a sin because the people went to worship before the one unto Dan, and he made a house of high places and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that is in Judah. And he offered upon the altar, and so he did in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So he offered upon the altar that which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that was devised in his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burned incense. The scriptures go on to heavily condemn this behavior. I'm not going to read all the condemnations. It's famous, but the principle here again is there's an unauthorized. In this case, the whole priesthood is just completely unauthorized. It's not even from the tribe of Levi, and this is condemned by God. But what about New Testament worship? It was mentioned. We have to explain that there's a different pattern in the New Testament. What is the different pattern in the New Testament? Well, Hebrews 10:19-25 explains the underlying principle on which New Testament worship differs from Old Testament worship. The difference is Jesus has come. It is the most earth-shattering difference that could possibly exist. Before, there's a priesthood that's an intermediary, as Fro pointed out. But now it says in Hebrews 10:19-25, having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus. We are entering in to the holiest. Before, that's only the high priest, the human high priest, by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he has consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. And having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let's hold fast to the profession of our faith without wavering, for he is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. So there is a New Testament worship of God through the high priest, which is now Jesus Christ, not a mere human, but Jesus Christ is the high priest. And there's no mention here in Hebrews where you would expect when he talks about the assembling of ourselves together, if there were a human priesthood, this would be the place to mention it. But instead, he doesn't say, that the author of Hebrews doesn't say, we now have a new priesthood to stand between us and Jesus Christ, or between us and God, except that Jesus is the new priest. Christ's new priesthood is described in great detail in Hebrews 7. I'm going to read it, 11 through 28. If therefore perfection were made by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, notice this, it's explicitly saying that the priesthood is changed. There is made of necessity a change also of the law. So yes, there was an Old Testament way of doing things, and it's not the same. There is of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertains to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it's evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek there arises another priest, who is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. For he testifies, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. There is verily a disannulling of the commandment going before, for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. This old priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, is disannulled. It's abrogated. It's set aside in favor of what it pointed toward. And that's the explanation that replaces this sanctioned idolatry, is typology, pointing forward to Christ, the shadow pointing to the substance. Verse 19, for the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better better hope did, by the which we draw nigh unto God. And inasmuch as not without an oath he was made priest, for those priests were made without an oath, but this with an oath, by him that said unto him, the Lord swear and will not repent, thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. And they truly were many priests. There were many priests, because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. But this man, because he continues forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. So before there were many priests, now there's one. He has an unchangeable priesthood. Wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing that he lives, that he ever lives, to make intercession for them. For such a high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice. Remember, we said, what's the role of priests? Bro mentioned one of the things, making sacrifices. But Jesus doesn't need to do that daily. He doesn't need to daily offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once, when he offered up himself. For the law makes men high priests, which have infirmity, but the word of the oath, which is since the law, makes the Son, who is consecrated forevermore. So Christ is the new priest, the only high priest. Yes, there's also the priesthood of believers. Peter talks about the fact that we are a holy priesthood, but that's all of us. A royal priesthood, a holy nation, a chosen generation. And that's true, but that's because we can now come directly. We don't need another layer of priests between us and Christ. We're now, because Christ is God and man, we approach directly to God through Jesus Christ. There's also, it didn't come up, but there's also some scriptural use of terms like elders or bishops, elders or presbyters, and overseers or bishops. Presbyteros in presbyters is actually etymologically linked to the English word priest. But this term presbyteros refers to the elders of the church, which are an equivalent office with overseers. Paul uses them interchangeably in Acts 20. In verse 17, he says he called the elders. Later on, he just refers to them as overseers, episcopos. So he uses those words interchangeably. There's other evidence that could be given of that same point, but these are just interchangeable terms for one office. that existed in the New Testament, but it's not a priestly office. The people are not commanded to make sacrifices on behalf of the people or be an intermediary like that. There is the use of the term hieros, but it is, again, it's about the priesthood of all believers. He's made us kings and priests unto God, is used 3 times in Revelation, as well as some other places perhaps. But let me come back to the conclusion. The conclusion is God did not ordain the Roman Catholic priesthood. Therefore, it's invalid. What other arguments one might try to craft for the value of a priesthood or the existence of priesthoods in other religions, non-Christian religions, or the value of a priesthood in the Old Testament time period, if God did not ordain it, it's invalid. That's my reason for going back to the regulative principle of worship, the strange fire, the sin of Korah, and the sin of Jeroboam. The reason for pointing those things out, and the singular principle, thou shalt not add thereto nor diminish from it, is that there is no divine ordination of a New Testament priesthood. Fro mentioned, he said some verses presuppose it. Maybe in the rebuttal we'll get into some responses to those the claims of at least one of those specific passages. But where has God ordained a New Testament priesthood? The answer is he did not, except that he ordained Christ. Christ is the one priest. He's offering the one sacrifice. Christians have never been free to invent ways to worship God. Christians have sometimes done this. Thankfully, God hasn't always answered them the way that he answered Korah and Nadab and Abihu, but they've never been free to invent ways to worship God, and the only New Testament priest is Christ. He has the distinct office of priest. Therefore, for all these reasons, the only conclusion we can reach is that without divine warrant, the Roman Catholic priesthood is invalid and ought to be rejected. And there's no time to yield back, so that's it.
Perfect timing. Okay, thank you very much, TurretinFan, and also Fro, for those 15-minute opening statements. Thank you to the both of you for the time you took to construct those. We're now moving into our rebuttal round. We have 12 minutes to respond. Before I hand it to you, Fro, I do want to remind the audience and anybody who is joining us now, we will be engaging in an audience Q&A once we're done with the main sessions here. So please, if you do have questions, objections, and challenges, send those in. The audience Q&A periods always help to make us expand even more on the topic. Okay, Fro, I do see you screen sharing again. Would you like me to put that up for you for the rebuttal?
Yes, please.
Okay. The floor is yours. 12 minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So first, I need to just kind of ask here. My opponent brought up things that invalidate the priesthood, that is to say, things that are being done. And he offered things like Korah's rebellion or strange fire, but I have very little in the way to know exactly how the Catholic priesthood has done anything similar to these that would invalidate it. I don't think that has been forthcoming as of yet. But secondly, this is the issue here. How do you justify the validity of Jude 11 and utilizing the Korah's rebellion narrative in order for its criticism to have any rhetorical force if there was no priesthood in the New Testament? These are all the things here that suggest there was a priesthood operating in the New Covenant, in the New Testament. Right here is that when we look at Hebrews, contrary to what TurretinFan argues, that there is a priesthood that is being described in the New Testament, but it isn't described outright for the same reason I don't feel the need to describe that I have arms and legs. It's just something that we're going to assume. And that was the world of the Hebraic author. And the main reason for this is because Jesus is never called our priest. He's never called our one priest. He's called our high priest. And that suggests something, that there are priests lower than him. And unless you want to call them angels, they're probably going to have to be human actors. But more importantly, if we actually take TurretinFan seriously here, then he has already disproven another core pillar of his own identity, which is sola scriptura, because Paul compares the Eucharist to two actual living sacrificial institutions. First of them is the temple sacrifice that were slitting the throats of bulls and goats and rams, and then to pagan sacrifices that were doing something different. And in order to make that work rhetorically, it requires ministers sacrificing the Eucharist, answering the same purpose that the Jewish priests and the pagan priests were doing in their respective institutions. Otherwise, this appeal has no force whatsoever. Paul might as well have just not said anything at all. So, and there are various things in instances whereby he just brings up things that are rather odd if there was no new covenant priesthood, such as Romans 12:1. It doesn't exactly mention sacrifice outright, but this is very weird language to use if it didn't exist. Similarly, I don't think he's really done any of these options, but admittedly, he didn't even have time too much anyway, because we're not at his cross-examination yet. But another thing that he has brought up is the fact that he's sort of right. The vocabulary of the New Testament does not tell us that there are priests. It doesn't use the Greek term hieros. And that's because the vocabulary of the New Testament is absolutely worthless. And the reason it's worthless is because it uses interchangeable words for everything, and the words we recognize the authors don't mean. So case in point, when we think of apostle, we think of the 12 people Jesus called to be his immediate disciples, including Paul. That's not what Paul thinks. Paul thinks anybody that has had a resurrection encounter with the post-resurrected Christ becomes an apostle. Well, according to Paul's own definition, and therefore the biblical definition, that's Saint Faustina. And that's something that TurretinFan is going to reject. Additionally, what goes on is that he uses offices in the New Testament that his own tradition doesn't have room for. Paul openly calls women apostles, but I'm not going to see TurretinFan recognize Junia on the same level as Paul. Paul also makes Phoebe a deaconess, but his tradition actively discriminates against that and does not ordain deaconesses on the teaching prescription, even though Paul doesn't seem to carry that opinion. So already what we have here is that the vocabulary he's trying to appeal to is kind of worthless to answer this question. But generally, he also goes to the Jeroboam's idolatry to demonstrate how this was a valid an invalidation of the priesthood. And he might be right, but it is also simultaneously proving my point. Jeroboam was not in sin because he was worshiping God through idols. He was in sin because he was making unsanctioned idols. He made golden calves that were supposed to be the thrones of God, presencing God's authority, but this was not done through official channels. This was not done through the intercessory of Jerusalem. It was not done through God's commandment. He went out of his own way to do that. Similarly, the other thing that goes on is that the very thing that he's appealing to in Hebrews is absolutely incoherent. At no point within the book of Hebrews are you ever going to encounter the idea that the priesthood was invalidated or was abrogated. That is eisegesis on TurretinFan's part, on Mr. Francis's part. The reason, quite simply put, is because Hebrews is all about explaining how the New Testament priesthood, how the priesthood under Jesus Christ is superior to the Old Testament priesthood. And it even says this outright when it talks about the sacrifice. It says that we have a table whereby the priests of the old law have no right to eat. This comparison only makes sense if the table of the New Testament, of the Eucharist, is actually supposed to be a legitimate sacrifice being ministered by actual priests. The very presuppositions of the New Testament and the very work he is appealing to sinks him. Similarly, that's why Jesus Christ is superior to the high priest. The high priest had to go before the Holy of Holies and had to make a sacrifice for his sins and the sins of the congregation. Jesus was sinless. He doesn't have to do that. But more to the point, the high priest simultaneously becomes the Holy of Holies. The Eucharist, which presences Jesus Christ, which presences God himself, has replaced the temple and the Ark of the Covenant as an idol. That becomes the center of mediation. And we even see this to this day. There's a reason in Protestant churches the world over, they will close their doors once the pastor leaves. He'll lock up the doors and they're locked. But especially the Catholics in the audience, y'all know this. There's at least a good 6 hours out of the day, and sometimes all night, my parish certainly does all night, where you can just walk up to the Catholic Church's doors, open them, go into the pews, and have private prayer. That is because the locus of divine presence is in that Holy of Holies, and that is made possible by the priest being an idol on God's behalf, being able to act in God's authority through Jesus's authority, being able to mediate and create the Holy of Holies where we can be in front of. That's what it means that the temple veil has been rent. We actually have access, direct physical access to the Holy of Holies that the old covenant didn't. That's why we drink the wine. That's why we eat the bread. It becomes the way in which God communes with us by making the sacrifice and the Holy of Holies one and the same. I think I'm going to donate the rest of my time here, but let me go through my checklist to see if I covered all my bases. Oh yeah, one other thing. Korah in his rebellion was punished for people for trying to be priests where he had no right. TurretinFan needs to apply this to the Catholic priesthood, and thus far I'm not seeing that materialize. But I also haven't seen his own rebuttal, so we'll see about that. However much time I have, I think I yapped on long enough. I will donate that to. Let's donate that to cross-examination.
Fro, thank you very much for that rebuttal. I will bring T-Fan back into here. And to the audience, I am nearly caught up on your questions. Katrina Cook, thank you very much for the support and the super chat.
Real quick before we begin, and sorry to interrupt, Francis, I am looking forward to the questions from the audience because it's looking a little crazy in there.
We've got a lively chat, which is a good sign, gentlemen. You are both generating some good discussion. So again, challenges, questions, objections to the chat, send those in, please. We look forward to engaging those. Okay, Katrina Cook, we've bumped your super chat to the top. Thank you very much. And I'll further catch up once we get into TurretinFan's rebuttal. So here we go. I am going to reset the timer. T-Fan, floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Time flies when you're having fun. So this will just fly by right now because we've been having fun so far. I hope folks have been edified and have learned a little bit as they've been listening to this debate. From my standpoint, in terms of the debate analysis, the first 10 minutes of my opponent's opening statement was directed towards what he views as kind of foundational principles behind his case. And I don't feel a lot of need to debate to rebut those points line by line. I think the idea of calling it sanctioned idolatry may be provocative. Certainly the Old Testament, when it refers to idolatry, never refers to it in favorable terms. It's always in unfavorable terms. Idolatry is always a negative concept. But, I think that part of this, we could just kind of set it aside because I don't think that the debate hinges on whether he's right about that point. Similarly, the questions about the angel of the Lord or angel of God, whether that is a theophany, as many have argued, or whether that's something other than a theophany, a merging of God's identity with the identity of the message bearer, so that the angel is improperly but reasonably referred to as God, even though, of course, the angel is the messenger of God. Whichever of those approaches we take, it doesn't seem to directly impact the conclusion of the debate. And certainly, from my standpoint, the arguments I'm offering against the validity of the Roman Catholic priesthood don't hinge from it. In fact, I don't see how those establish specifically the Roman Catholic priesthood out of every possible priesthood. For example, the Aaronic priesthood, that one has divine warrant, had divine warrant up to a point, but has no longer has it. So we can kind of set aside that first 10 minutes of the opening argument and some portions of the conclusion part of that opening argument as well. But what about the appeals to the New Testament scriptures, saying there was a comment that somehow in the back of Paul's mind is a New Testament priesthood, and that there's sort of the New Testament presupposes a continuation or some new priesthood. My answer to that is that the burden of establishing that the Roman Catholic priesthood is valid is on the person presenting the case for the Roman Catholic priesthood. In other words, show us where God has authorized the Roman Catholic priesthood. And we haven't seen that. In fact, we've just seen, well, it's just presupposed, it's behind the scenes. So let's take a quick look at, for example, the first passage that was emphasized was 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 21. There was somehow, it was said that the Eucharist is compared to sacrifices. Let's read briefly what the text says. It says, "Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men, judge what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, being many, are one bread and one body. We are one bread and we are one body, because we're all partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What do I say then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifices to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils." Is there a comparison here between the Eucharist, between the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, and the Old Testament sacrifices and the pagan sacrifices? Certainly there's a comparison here. Of course, we saw why there's that comparison, because Christ's death on the cross is the ultimate sacrifice, which this sacrament points us to. It's a sacrament of the death of Christ. It's the cup of the new covenant in his blood. So it points us to the one sacrifice that Christ made. However, what Paul doesn't say is that we have new sacrifices, that there is some new sacrifices that come along. But even if he did, we would still need to say, where are the priests? Who's ordained as a priest by God? It's not the sons of Aaron. Who is it? We need divine warrant to have a priesthood. There is no such divine warrant here. We could do, looking at the other passages, we look at Hebrews 5. It says, every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God. But who ordained the Roman Catholic priesthood? We haven't been offered any evidence that anyone ordained them. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way? For he that himself is also compassed with infirmity, and by reason hereof he ought, as to the people, so also for himself to offer for sins. And no man takes this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. In other words, Hebrews 5:4 stands against the resolution, because it's not appropriate for human beings to just assume the office of priest. It has to come from God. There's no evidence then offered that the Roman Catholic priesthood came from God. Without something to establish that the Roman Catholic priesthood comes from God, we just have to reject it, because we must not go beyond what's commanded by God. That's that principle from Deuteronomy, which wasn't addressed. In fact, he acknowledged that Korah's rebellion was that they assumed to themselves something they had no right to do. But yet he hasn't established a right for Roman Catholic priests to take this on it. And the fact that they're ordained by other Roman Catholic priests or by the bishops is just begs the question. It would just beg the question, if you appeal to that, From where did they get the authority? When did God appoint them the authority to ordain priests? Now, it is said that Christ is the high priest, and he said, well, high priest assumes lower priests, to which my answer is no, it doesn't. But if you insist that it does, the answer is that all Christians are referred to as priests using the Greek word hieros. I know he said that the new vocabulary of the New Testament is absolutely useless. I think it's absolutely useless to establish the affirmative side of this case. But it's not absolutely useless because Christ is our high priest. He is the one who's described as offering up sacrifice, and he's better than the Old Testament priesthood that's abrogated and set aside. And yes, I showed from Scripture that that's the case. He says that it's eisegesis, but he didn't demonstrate that it was eisegesis. He didn't go through the passage and show that what I said is wrong. And what I said isn't wrong. You could see it on the screen as I was explaining it. He says that there's Jeroboam's idolatry. It wasn't the sin of idolatry itself. It was that it was unsanctioned idols. But again, where's the sanction for the Roman Catholic priesthood? We haven't been offered any sanction for the Roman Catholic priesthood, not even for a general New Testament priesthood, much less specifically the Roman Catholic priesthood. Let's see. He mentioned that there's a verse in Romans 12:1. He says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. But that is sacrificial language, but that's us presenting our bodies to God. If that's a priestly action, nevertheless, it's for all believers. The priesthood of believers, which we said the New Testament teaches, but that's not what the Roman Catholic priesthood is. It's not the priesthood of all believers. It's a special category of intermediaries, people who are supposedly exercising what he described as either in the person of Christ or alter Christus roles. Let's see what else. He set up some criteria by which he thought that I'd need to go through these hoops to disprove his case. I don't believe that's the way. I think the easier way is this. Unless God has warranted the Roman Catholic priesthood, it's not valid. The only way for it to be valid is if God ordained it, and it hasn't been shown that God ordained it. But he says, I would need to deny that this idolatry that's sanctioned in the positive sense is I need to deny that model works, and I need to offer some alternative model. Well, the alternative model is typology, that these priests stood as a shadow of what was going to come, that they weren't the real thing. They were pointing to something greater. I don't know whether he thinks that's an adequate explanation. As far as how explaining the theophanies or other comments about certain people being identified with God, again, I don't think that has any bearing on the conclusion of this debate, because whether he's correct about that assessment or not doesn't make the Roman Catholic priest valid where it would otherwise be invalid, or vice versa. And then he said, I have to account for the numerous New Testament texts that presuppose a priesthood, to which the answer is, there is a New Testament priesthood. It's Christ. He's over and over called our high priest. In Hebrews, he replaces the priesthood of the Old Testament. And then all of us are described as priests. We're a kingdom of priests. We all have access now to the holiest place. So is there a New Testament priesthood? It's the priesthood of all believers and Christ. If you think that Christ's high priestly role requires lower priests, you have an answer, the priesthood of believers, but not a separate category of priests in between those people and God. And the reason is, for this dramatic change in how God's operating, is the incarnation of Jesus Christ. That's what changed everything. That's what the author of Hebrews argues, that this is the better thing that we have that the people before us didn't have. He says we have an altar, Hebrews 13:10, we have an altar whereof they have no right to eat, which serve the tabernacle, because the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. So you notice the comparison is the actual historical event of Jesus to those animal sacrifices of the Old Testament, not some new sacrifices in replacing the old. And with that, I've used up my time.
TurretinFan, thank you very much for that rebuttal. Gentlemen, we are moving along smoothly. That completes our opening statements of 15 minutes and our rebuttals of 12. Plenty on the table now to engage in a cross-exam. I will give our guests, Fro and TurretinFan, 2 minutes to get themselves organized for the cross-examination as I go through some reminders and also some announcements. And so for those that enjoy these kinds of debates, especially these debates on Catholics versus Protestants, we have another one of our main events coming up next week. Time flies by when you're having fun hosting and doing debates. I feel like we just scheduled this and it's already here. So we've got another debate on Catholicism and Protestantism. This is specifically a Baptist versus Catholic. The Great Faith Alone debate, Pastor Jason Robinson and Brian Mercier from Catholic Truth. Don't forget to hit that reminder bell. You definitely don't want to miss this one. Then we kick off August with a bang. We've got this much anticipated debate showdown between Dr. George Antonios and Dr. Dustin Smith on the question, is the doctrine of the Trinity taught in the Bible? I am pumped for this one. Also in August, we have another debate on the Trinity. This time it's between Matt Slick and Robert Bolag on the question, is the doctrine of the Trinity biblical? And we want to end the summer with a bang. We mentioned this one earlier. We've got a 2 versus 2 debate showdown on regeneration. Calvinists versus non-Calvinists, CJ Cox and TurretinFan taking on Chuck Krause and Dan Chapa. Does regeneration precede faith? I know all 4 of these debaters. I've hosted them all, and they are well studied. I'm sure we are going to be getting an edifying and thought-provoking debate with this one. That is for sure. Next week, we've also got TurretinFan back to debate CJ Cox on is 1 John 5:7 original. I think this is the first time we will be getting this matchup between these two seasoned debaters. We've also got a predestination debate showdown next week. Scott Anoski versus Chuck Krause. If you have not yet seen this debate that took place 2 nights ago, this fiery exchange on the Raging Tomato with host Sarah. Sam, my award-winning co-host, and I, we debated formally Austin Sims and the Kentucky Atheist on Adam and Eve. Wow, tons of fun. The format was very interactive after we completed the formal exchange and also the Q&A. We engaged in an open mic where it was a free-for-all and some memorable moments there, that's for sure. Okay, gentlemen, it is cross-examination time. We've got, well, I guess Fro donated some minutes from about 6 minutes, roughly, if I remember correctly. So why don't we do 28 minutes each for cross-exam, if you guys are cool with that, as cross-exam usually flies by pretty quick. Okay.
Yep. And if TurretinFan doesn't mind, if he feels so inclined, he can cross me first.
You know what?
I don't exactly know who's going first and who's going second, but I'm not entirely sure. But if he wants to, he can go first, or I can go first. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's stick with the format since Turretin just ended with his rebuttal.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Let's have you go first. To the audience, okay. I am all caught up on your questions. Keep those questions coming in so we can have some fun interacting with them in the Q&A. Fro, you have 28 minutes to lead the way in cross-exam. Go ahead.
Okay. So in the Romans passages you cited, and that I kind of know, where it talks about the table in which the Old Testament priests have no right to eat, do you think the only thing it's trying to compare is the manner of death in so much as the sacrifice are concerned?
I think you mean the Hebrews passage, Hebrews 13, that we have an altar that they don't have a right to eat about?
Yes.
Okay, and what was your question about that?
Do you think the only thing that the author is trying to compare is the fact that the sacrifices had to die, or do you think there's a deeper thing going on there?
I think the deeper thing is that rather than the animal sacrifice, we have Jesus who died outside of Jerusalem.
Okay, so here's the issue now. You would agree that Jesus is called a high priest, yes?
I definitely agree, yes.
Okay, what is he high over? Because when you hear about a high office, a high administrator, okay, even in the Roman system, the Pontifex Maximus, high priest, it means you're typically higher than every other one in that office. No?
It does usually mean that you have the most elevated position in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So who are the low priests then?
Well, we could, as I said, we could refer that to all believers as being
Okay.
the nation of priests underneath
What do you
that high priest.
Sorry for interrupting your answer. I'm getting a little excited. Real quick then, what do you sacrifice?
Well, we offer our bodies as a reasonable sacrifice. We offer up thanksgiving. We offer prayers.
So what part of your body do you give up?
We don't offer it in the way of like mutilation or cutting off.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand that. That's rhetorical. My point is, what is the nature of that sacrifice you're describing?
It's that we are offering ourselves our bodies to serve God.
Okay.
So bodily service to God.
Fair enough. Now, when you look at sacrifices in the Old Testament, what did they consist of?
Well, there were the animal sacrifices. There were also some other kinds of sacrifices as well, but there's the offering of incense. There's also the bread offering. There's a variety of offerings in the Old Testament.
And so in each case, you actually lose something, don't you?
Well, in some cases, you don't lose anything. You actually consume the thing that you're offering. Yeah.
Correct. And so my question is, how does that actually work in your sacrificial system where you're sacrificing your service, you're serving God? But by being a Christian, isn't that already presupposed? Isn't that just the default state? What is your sacrifice then?
If you mean what's the victim, I would agree that there's not a victim in that kind of sacrifice.
So then what you would have to conclude then, and maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me, that your sacrifice and the sacrifice of the Old Covenant don't really share any common features at all. Is that about right?
If you're excluding the most important sacrifice in our system, which is Jesus Christ, then yes.
Okay. So here's the issue. Those sacrifices were also continuous. There was a very real way in which they continued throughout history. Okay. Christ might be the one sacrifice for all, but then how do we actually then understand the Pauline understanding of the Eucharist, where it is a continual sacrifice being offered to God in his presence when we were in 1 Corinthians 10?
So I don't think we would call it a continual sacrifice of Christ's death because it's a one-time event.
Should I read that? I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I read the relevant passage to you? Would you be opposed to that?
Please read it, yeah.
Okay. Here we are. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. In this context, what is the table of demons and what is the cup of demons?
The pagan sacrifices.
So what's the table of the Lord and what's the cup of the Lord?
The Lord's Supper.
So therefore, why is he comparing the Lord's Supper to the table of demons and the cup of demons? Because
Christ's death is a true sacrifice.
Ah, okay. So therefore, the Lord's Supper is a true sacrifice, yes?
The Lord's Supper is a memorial of the true sacrifice.
Is that what Paul says?
In that particular verse, he doesn't say that, but he says that. I'm trying to remember where the words of institution are.
Oh, well,
maybe chapter 13.
well, actually, I can do you one even better. The Gospels themselves call it a memorial, but the term is anamnesis. Do you know what that word means in Greek?
It means memorial. That's why it's translated that way.
No. There's actually a religious connotation to that. It essentially means a memorial sacrifice. It's definitely a memorial, but it is a sacrifice given to memorialize something. Okay? So,
I mean, I stand by my original answer.
Okay,
you can disagree, I guess.
But you can stand by your answer. Okay, I'm just asking the questions here.
Yeah, it seems like you're actually offering a rebuttal here, but
possibly, just a little bit. You can grill me, you can roast me the same way when it's your turn. I promise. I'll take it.
That's all good.
The other thing I wanted to bring up, you mentioned that you don't see where God ordained the New Testament priesthood. Yes.
I said that I don't see where God ordained the Roman Catholic priesthood.
Okay. So my question to you is, do you think that's actually necessary? Let me kind of rephrase that and maybe enhance that a bit.
Okay.
If we're reading verses in the Bible where it's very clear that the authors are presupposing a priesthood exists, even if they aren't expressly painting the scene as when these ordinations happen, is that in and of itself enough to conclude that they did happen?
I'm not against the evidence for the divine ordinance being somehow less than perfectly explicit, but my contention is that it's not either explicit or implicit.
So when we have Paul describing the fact that the Lord's Supper and comparing it directly to the blood sacrifices of the temple and of pagan institutions, that isn't implicit?
It may be implicit that there's a priest, but that priest is Jesus Christ, according to the rest of the New Testament. So that doesn't imply some further priesthood.
Okay, fair enough. Actually, speaking of, you mentioned, at least in passing, the priesthood of all believers, no?
Yep.
Explain what you mean by that.
I mean that we now have the ability to communicate with God in a way that before the Old Testament priests were able to do, but now we can do that. So that's the sense in which we have taken on something of what was proper to the Old Testament priests before. We
couldn't do that in Moses' time?
We could not enter the holiest of holies in the time of Moses, no.
Okay. So real quick, can you recite for me the relevant passage in the New Testament? I think it's from 1 Peter.
Of the priesthood of believers? There is a passage in 1 Peter that I mentioned on one of my slides. I can give you the quotation, 1 Peter 2, 4 through 10.
Please do so.
So, to whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious, you also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Do you want me to continue, or?
No, I think that's enough. What are the holy stones referring to?
Believers.
Mm-hmm. What is it in reference to?
The church. We're established as the church.
Specifically, and you might not know this because I didn't know it till yesterday, so I'm just going to share this. It's also referring to the priest's tunic of the 12 stones in the tunic of the Old Testament priesthood, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Next question. This is where we're going to get to relevance here. We could not do what we do today in Moses' time, right?
We can't do everything that we could do.
Okay. Yeah. So in what way then did Moses also have a kingdom of priests, given the fact that he's calling Israel the same kingdom of priests in the context where there's also a ministerial priesthood without contradiction here?
What are you referring to when you say Moses?
Exodus 19. In Exodus 19, Moses actually calls Israel a kingdom of priests, or the priesthood of all believers. And he does this because it's from Israel where you get your priests from.
Okay. So what's your observation is like Exodus 19:6, you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now your view is that this is, although it's presented there in the future, that was already a present reality in the Old Testament period, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Well, because here's the thing. I think you might be reading from the King James. Okay, shall actually how put it? Shall actually denotes command. In fact, other verses and other translations will use the term are. You are to me a kingdom of priests. And so back in Old English, which if you're reading from the King James, that would make more sense of this, that it's referring to a command of being. And that is to say, I think it would be more accurate to say this is less having anything to do with priesthood as much as it has to do with identity marker. No? Would you agree with that?
I'm willing to go along with your point that shall here is an imperative. So that part we're tracking on. The second part of this, though, about whether it's if you mean it's merely an identity marker, that I would not agree that it's merely an identity marker. But I would also agree that they're not priests like the Levitical priests. They're not priests like Aaron was a priest, yet they are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. But I would see that as being primarily fulfilled in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament, even though I agree that it's an imperative concept there.
Okay, so my question is, how do you therefore use that to somehow invalidate a priesthood today, and the Catholic priesthood specifically, when that could not invalidate the priesthood of Aaron?
I don't need to invalidate it. All I need to do is establish that you have no authority for this priesthood that you're proposing.
Okay. Actually, let's kind of go somewhere. Let's kind of shift gears here for a bit. In my presentation, I had determined and showed that the way God had always communicated with his people is by using physical media to presence him, whether that was the priest himself, whether that was the ark, whether that was the temple, all examples of idols. Okay. So my question to you now, okay, does it cause you any discomfort of the fact that you don't have anything that kind of follows that same logic or pattern? And if you don't, and if you're willing to admit you don't, how can you not therefore conclude that God hasn't changed?
God hasn't changed, but the incarnation has occurred, which transforms worship from being a worship in the shadows and types in the Old Testament to being a spirit and truth worship in the New Testament. So those old symbols of God's presence are done away with in place of the true reality of Jesus Christ, who has now come.
Okay, so the shadows and types, but they existed, didn't they?
Yes.
Okay, so what we have within the shadows of the types, okay, is a group of men that act as idols that can bring about the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. Yes?
I don't think that's not how I would use the word idols. So maybe there's another word we could find that would mean the same thing without getting bogged down on that.
I kind of mentioned this earlier on in my presentation. A word is simply the definitions we give it. And so the reason I refer to idol is because functionally that's what these things do in every religion. Okay. I'm not particularly concerned with the moral aspects of pagan religions. That's irrelevant to me. It's about the function that these things are doing. So what word would you rather use?
Well, I don't know if it's necessary for you to use any word for that point. Maybe you can convey the point without using that word. I don't know, but
Okay.
I know you're trying to like get us towards some agreement. So maybe you can try to step me towards that piece by
Okay,
piece.
fair enough, fair enough. What we see within the old covenant then is that there are always these intermediaries, right,
Mhm.
that actually allow us to be in divine presence. Okay.
Right.
Within Hebrews, what we see is that the Holy of Holies has also become that intermediary. Yes.
I would say that Jesus is that intermediary and that not something else. So Jesus himself is the intermediary.
Okay. So Jesus himself is the intermediary and he's the high priest too. Yes.
Yep.
So how can he be high priest and not have priests under him? And well, I think we went over this a little bit, but so let me kind of enhance this a bit.
Sure.
The high priest in the old covenant would have been priests under him making sacrifice. Yes.
So the Old Testament Levitical priests there were priests that made sacrifices other than the high priest. Not all the sacrifices, but some of them, yes.
Okay. So how therefore can we have a priesthood of all believers where we're all priests in some way, but we are giving what is ostensibly alien sacrifices to anything they themselves would have known?
Because our worship is now spiritual, not carnal. So our incense that we offer is not carnal incense like the Old Testament sacrifices. We offer the spiritual incense of prayers, as an example. So it is true that, of course, the Old Testament believers also offered prayers, but that we're now offering directly with God without any other intermediary except Jesus Christ.
So are you suggesting that there is a immeasurable distinction between the spiritual and the carnal? What are you trying to define, or what are you trying to make a boundary between those two things? What boundaries are you trying to make here?
You mean the boundary between physical offering up of incense with burning it in the fire and producing an aroma versus praying to God directly?
You mentioned carnal and spiritual, so these are the terms you used. I'll let you define that. What boundary are you trying to make between these things?
I'm making a distinction between these physical items in the old covenant that represented a spiritual reality in the new covenant.
Mm-hmm. So would you therefore conclude that the offering of incense and the blood being sacrificed and sprinkled on the congregation was physical or carnal and not spiritual?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So the people that were engaging in this were just doing this for pure carnality and not anything deeper, nothing spiritual? What do you mean by spiritual? That might be the better question to ask.
So they were participating with those carnal elements. They were pointing towards the spiritual reality. That blood of animals does nothing to remove sin, but it pointed to the blood of Christ, which does remove sin. The incense itself doesn't bring the message to God, but it symbolizes the prayers of believers, which does go to God.
Right, because in the old covenant, it was God himself that removed sin. I think we'd be right about that. The question now I kind of have is the idea now that somehow what they're doing is not spiritual at all. It's kind of incomprehensible to me. Can you kind of define that a bit better? Maybe I'm just dumb. All right. So explain it to me like I'm 4.
I certainly didn't mean to suggest that you're dumb.
I know. I did. Go ahead.
No, I'm suggesting that they worshipped under these physical signs, like a veil in front of their eyes. They were worshiping God, but through this veil. They couldn't see beyond it, but it was there. They only perceived it by faith, but they could only see it far away. Something better has come to us.
I would certainly agree but that veil they were seeing far away, therefore makes it non-spiritual.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't answer that part of it. No, I'm not saying that there's nothing spiritual to their worship, but that they were burdened with the physical as well.
I see. So in the definition of your worship, it has to be completely non-physical. Is that an accurate assessment? Or am I mistaken? You tell me.
No, it's not completely non-physical, but almost all of those physical elements have been removed. There's no longer a temple. There's no longer animal sacrifices. There's no longer physical incense that's burnt. There's almost all these things are done away with. The only physical elements that were ordained by God for the New Testament believers are water for baptism and the bread and cup for communion. No, there's no other physical elements that are ordained by God for the New Testament worship.
I see. And so, just so we're clear, that therefore the priests which Christ is high over are not ministerial priests, no?
Well, Christ's priesthood is like that of Melchizedek. There's no need for additional priests offering the same sacrifices over and over again, because he's offered once for all. There's no need to have, even though he's called high priest, there's no need to have a layer of priests underneath him and between the people.
And that's actually a very good. That's actually a very good tangent point. Now, what exactly makes the Melchizedek priesthood? Well, let's assume the Melchizedek priesthood. What can you? Why do you assume from those premises that your conclusion that there can't be lower priests now a valid conclusion to come to? Because I don't see how I think that feels like a non sequitur to me.
Because the singularity of Christ's priesthood is contrasted with the multiplicity of priests, and the justification is that he has the priesthood of Melchizedek, one that he holds permanently, and therefore there's no need for additional priests. And in addition, there's only one sacrifice, which is his sacrifice. Therefore, there's no need for additional priests to perform additional sacrifices.
So here's the thing: the once for all sacrifice is referring to essentially Christ having become the Holy of Holies. Okay, would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay, then how exactly can there be any comparison or relation at all between the old covenant sacrifices that Hebrews is clearly trying to create and what it's advocating for? Because in order for there to be any comparison, there has to be something to compare beyond the fact that these things died. A lot of things die. It doesn't mean there's any relation between them.
So if you're asking what's the relationship between the Old Testament sacrifice and the Christ's own sacrifice, the relationship is that there's a victim who's put to death in place of as a substitute for the penalty of sin, which is death. So this death is taken on behalf of the sacrificial victim in place of the beneficiary of that sacrifice. That's what Christ's death on the cross was for his people. So he was put to death so that we don't have to receive the penalty of sin.
I see. So then what do you think Jude is trying to explain in Jude 11? I don't know if you have it up, but if you don't, I can probably read it out for you. Do you want me to?
I'm either way is fine. I have it in front of me.
Okay, then can you start from maybe verse 7 or 8 and read up till 11 or 12?
Even like Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities around them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Likewise, also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, did not dare to bring against him railing accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke thee." But these speak evil of those things they don't know. But what they know naturally as brute beasts, in those things they corrupt themselves. Woe unto them, for they've gone in the way of Cain and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward and perished in the gainsayings of Korah. Okay. That's verse 11.
Right. So if there's a kingdom of all priests and every priest is a believer to some degree and every believer is a priest, what is the rhetorical goal here? Because it doesn't seem the objection given here actually has much weight under your premises.
So what these have in common are the way of Cain. Cain offered an unauthorized sacrifice. Mm-hmm. The error of Balaam is he's offering up religious services against
God,
the people of God. And the gainsaying of Korah are, again, people trying to offer some unauthorized worship. And so the connection there is with the introduction of these people earlier, that these are people who crept in unawares, verse 4, that they were ordained to condemnation, that they've turned the grace of God into lasciviousness and denied the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. So their worship of something other than the true Lord is this unauthorized worship.
All right, I have 2 minutes, well, about a little over 2 minutes left. I think I'll probably donate some of that to the audience Q&A. I just have 2 questions left for you now. First of all, I have a question about vocabulary. How is it that you therefore determine that there is no priesthood for the New Testament when, first of all, 2 things are operant here? The first thing is that virtually every word of the Romance language, every word that describes one who gives sacrifice from the Romance languages, is tied to the Greek word presbyteros, and even modern Greek does that too, by the way. And secondly, how do you therefore conclude that the vocabulary of the New Testament means anything at all when, according to Paul, women can both be apostles and deacons, and your own tradition doesn't recognize that? So how are you trying to make your case by using the vocabulary of the New Testament to support it when Paul and virtually every New Testament writer does not mean by these words what we mean today? And those are my 2 questions. And the rest of my time, I think I'm going to donate to audience Q&A.
All right. So as far as the use of the vocabulary of the New Testament, the writing of the New Testament is adequate for the purposes for which it was intended. So in other words, the Holy Spirit inspired the authors of the New Testament to write what they wrote. This is taught to us from the New Testament. So in some sense, I'm begging the question by using the New Testament to explain the New Testament, but it's a reasonable fundamental principle that we can believe what God has said. And therefore, given that God has said what's in the New Testament, we can do what he said. We can also learn from the New Testament and the Old Testament that the purpose of God's communication is, and we can use that as an example, the end of John's Gospel, where he says, these things were written so that you may believe, and by believing you can have eternal life. Therefore, it's that from that, we can conclude that the meaning of the words is sufficiently clear to be understood by someone who reads them. It's not that they could be understood by everyone perfectly in every case. Peter admits that some of the things that are written in Paul's letters are hard to understand, but he states that those hard to understand things are wrested by folks who are wicked against their meaning. Not that the problem is with what Paul has written, even though it is hard to understand.
Planned perfectly, T-Fan. It was like 3, 2, 1, and then boom, you were done with your answer. So well played, gentlemen. Well played.
Yep. Also, about 2 minutes and 35 seconds was donated to Q&A. Just noting that for you, Donnie.
So T-Fan, did you?
No, that was my time questioning T-Fan.
Okay.
I just asked him one more question.
I think T-Fan,
he answered it.
I think T-Fan may have had 28 minutes on the clock, or did you take another 2 off, T-Fan?
I didn't take any time off the clock myself.
That's okay. I think we went 28 minutes, but we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So, gentlemen, excellent, stimulating first cross-examination. Good stuff. To the audience, I'm all caught up on your questions, your challenges, and super chats. I appreciate the support. You guys are the life and blood of Standing for Truth Ministries. Those are bumped to the top. I really enjoy seeing the lively chat, all the opinions, views, and arguments going around. So send those arguments in the form of questions. We'll have some fun interacting with them. Okay, we have 28 more minutes. This time, Fro, you get to lead the way, holding T-Fan's feet to the fire. 28 minutes, starting. To T-Fan.
Yeah.
What am I thinking?
It
was just so laid back and chill that first 28 minutes. I wasn't even sure who was, leading the way. Okay. So T-Fan, go ahead.
I'm glad it was laid back because I think I was probably just grilling him for a little while there. I wasn't trying to be that mean.
No, that was good. That was a good professional exchange. So now T-Fan gets to hold your feet to the fire, I should be saying. 28 minutes.
I'm ready.
Have some fun, guys. 28 minutes starting
real
now.
Quick, hold on. Before you start that, let me start my own right now.
All right. So my first question, I think it's the most important question, is
Go ahead.
when did God ordain the Roman Catholic priesthood?
Well, the official answer is going to be at the Last Supper, but the ordination is a bit more blurry, and we only have the gospel accounts to go on. Does that answer your question, or would you like me to be more substantive?
Are you saying that it's implicit in the Last Supper account, or are you
Yes.
saying that it was just something that happened at the same time?
It would be implicit, and also the fact that there is other texts throughout the New Testament that actually give the apostles authority. The ones that come to mind is Peter receiving the keys of the kingdom, which was the authority of the high priest when the king was away. The other ones that go over is the fact that the apostles receive keys of their own. It is another example of priestly authority. And then there's also the washing of the feet at the Last Supper, which was a one step in priestly ordination in the Old Covenant. And finally, it was the command to do this in memory of me. Earlier established anamnesis takes on liturgical and sacrificial connotations, meaning he's asking them to perform a kind of sacrifice in his memory. That's very that word is just rich in priestly nomenclature and vocabulary.
So, according to this ordination, who are the priests as opposed to non-priests?
I do not know what you mean by that. Can you explain to me like I'm four?
So, presumably, you believe there's some kind of continuity between the Old Covenant, where there's a priesthood and there's people who are not priests, clergy, laity, some distinction between
Correct.
priests and non-priests.
Correct.
What's that? What the cases you gave were cases where everyone present receives the thing. So in the case of the Last Supper, everyone in the room receives the Last Supper. Everyone's addressed by the you and so forth. As I understand, is that correct so far?
Thus far, yes.
And when you talked about the keys being distributed in Matthew 18, that's to all the apostles. And I don't know if there's somebody who's excluded from having those keys in that passage, or if you have something in mind. Yeah.
Well, the key passages kind of happen different time periods depending on which gospel you read, but largely it's believed that every apostle gets a key. Peter gets special authority in Matthew 16, but these are all images of priestly authority.
But
did I answer your question?
Well, partially, I think. But my question goes beyond that, which is,
go ahead.
How is it that not all believers get those keys?
Oh, certainly, because the apostles, and therefore the people that they lay hands on, are those that have received the authority of priests. Okay, that is precisely why the only people in the Aaronic priesthood that can be priests were the sons of Aaron and the Levites. And that's it. These were the people that received the authority. And so what makes a priest within the new covenant isn't merely just receiving the blood of Levi and Aaron. That has nothing to do with the priestly order of Melchizedek. Now it has far more to do with he that bears the authority of Christ. That's what it means to be a priest.
Would you agree that all believers have the authority of Christ to resist the devil?
Yes, that is something that has been granted not just by Jesus, but by the Godhead itself.
So if we have the authority of Jesus Christ, as all believers have the authority of Jesus Christ, then where is this distinction between priest and non-priest among believers?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, how would I put it? That's kind of like explain to a 14-year-old, you have the authority to unlock and lock your door, and therefore you have the authority to drive. No, it don't work like that. Okay. There are some responsibilities that the laity have that God has entrusted us to, such as to resist the temptations of the devil, to be holy as God is holy. Okay. But there are other things which we clearly have not been given responsibility of. The ability to bind and loose, the ability to forgive sins. Okay. That is something that was unique to the apostles and those that have received their authority, because the whole authority of Christ flows through them. Does that answer your question?
I think it answers the question, but I have leads to a follow-up, which is
Go ahead.
how do you know that it's only given to them and uniquely given to them and not given to all?
Well, for two reasons. Because I told you this already, that the vocabulary in the New Testament is very fluid. Okay, what we mean by apostles, not what Paul does, but when we actually look at these people, the relationship between Paul and his churches, the relationship between Timothy and Titus, and the people that they received to govern over. You okay?
Your
okay.
video.
I'll continue. I'm going to assume.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to assume you heard all that, and I'll continue. Okay. When we actually look at these relationships, it's very clear there is a hierarchy here, and it basically goes down from apostle, then bishop or elder. Those two words are interchangeable in the first century, and then down to deacon. Okay. And so we have these authority structures where the apostles are laying on hands and actually passing on people that do receive their authority. And this isn't even just in the Bible. There are people written in and around the same time while an apostle is still alive and articulating this relationship between these men. Irenaeus of Lyon, I think he's writing about, or it's either Ignatius of Antioch, one of those two. They're actually very clear about that. If you don't have a bishop, you don't have a church, because you don't have deacons, you can't have priests. And so what goes on, there is a clear authority structure here that the apostles are part of, and they're the higher tier, and the authority that they have comes down, all right, to those men to which they ordain. Did that answer your question also?
At least in part, but again, let me follow up. So there's one question about whether there's an authority structure, but you would agree that there were the chief of the chief of the synagogues in first century Judaism. The chief of the synagogue was not somebody who was a priest, correct?
No, the chief of the synagogue, if I remember correctly, would have been the high priest, unless I'm wrong. Okay, and therefore he would be a priest.
Okay. Well, maybe we have to
again, I might be wrong. Okay.
Right.
I don't think I am, but I might be. So I'm just going to say I don't know.
Okay. Well, maybe this is less controversial then. The elders of the 12 tribes were not priests, except presumably in the tribe of Levi. But the elders of the other tribes of the children of Israel were not priests, yet they had authority, right?
Correct.
So, and the Davidic monarchy did not have the priesthood, yet it had authority within the Old Testament system, correct?
Repeat that again.
The Davidic monarchy, and the other monarchies that existed, but the Davidic monarchy had authority, real authority, divine authority, but it was not a priesthood, correct?
I wouldn't say it had divine authority. I think that might be going a bit too far, but it did have real authority. Yes.
So when Samuel the prophet anointed David, that was not giving him divine authority to be king?
No, that was good. Well, I know what you mean now. That was God's decision to be king, but it's a different thing from the king acting in the way that priests do. All right, that's a very different thing.
I agree that they're different, but my question is, just because we have authorities in the New Testament, it doesn't follow that those need to be priesthood authorities, correct?
I would agree, which is also why earlier on in this cross, I brought up all the instances in which they're not just receiving authority, they're receiving authority that specifically was reserved for priests. If they were just giving authority, like say, I don't know, kingship or something like eldership, that's one thing, you'd have a point. But they're not just receiving any old authority. It's a specific kind that we get from distributing of the keys, the authority to bind and loose, to forgive sin. Okay, these are specifically things that only priests and high priests could do, meaning they are receiving an authority of a specific office and a priestly office.
Let's focus on the question of the forgiveness of sins.
Go ahead.
In the Lord's Prayer, do you agree that the petition, forgive us our debts or trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, is something that every believer can pray, not just priests?
Correct.
So then the forgiveness of sins is something that every Christian has the ability to do, correct?
No, that does not necessarily apply. That in the Lord's Prayer, which we can pray, it says, "Forgive our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Meaning, it's not saying that we can just go to God and forgive our sins. What it's saying is that the criteria for having our sins forgiven is for forgiving the people that have wronged us. If we don't forgive others, we ourselves aren't forgiven. And John Chrysostom actually does this, because when he was a priest in, I don't know if that was, I forget where he was, but I think it was somewhere in Anatolia. When he was over his own congregation, he actually writes that when that came up in the liturgy, his audience wanted to skip that part, all right, because that's scary. Meaning that the intent of that prayer is that for our sins to be forgiven, we must forgive others. It is not therefore saying that it does not require the vacancy of a priest, nor does it require that we can go to God without the mediation of a priest for every sin. Does that answer your question?
I think my question is, surely in order for us to forgive others, we must have the power to forgive others. Doesn't that seem like it must follow?
It does, correct. That part follows. It does not follow, therefore, we also have the power to go to God, right, to have our own sins forgiven without the mediation. We can forgive other human beings, but there is a qualitative difference between us and God. That's the boundary I talked about in my presentation.
So we have the power to go to the Holy of Holies, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And there, in the Holy of Holies, what could we ask God for? Can we ask him for the forgiveness of sins?
Yes, we can.
So what is it then that's lacking in the believers in this? Because you mentioned before that there's a priesthood authority of forgiving sins, and yet it seems that you say that both Christians can ask for God directly for the forgiveness of sins by entering the Holy of Holies, and that they are also able to forgive the sins of other Christians or other people. Not, it doesn't even have to be Christians that sin against them. So it seems as though that then this power to forgive sins is not a marker of the priesthood, which is what was your original claim.
Well, that's actually the thing. What goes on is that our power to forgive sins is not, how about it? When it's being talked about in the Gospels, it's talking about God's power to forgive sins, and we know that because the other things it promises, that which is bound on earth will be bound in heaven, that which is loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. And this is the only time in which that is actually given, because what I want to say, slights that are done against you by others is different than the sins you might commit against God. Okay. But the other thing about it is, too, it is our ability to go to the Holy of Holies that allows us to go directly to God. The fact is, as a Protestant, you don't really have a Holy of Holies. You don't have the true presence where God actually dwells in your sanctuaries, where Jesus actually is there with you. You don't have that. And by your own admission, you don't have that because you believe in a memorialist view. The Catholic Church doesn't believe that. And so everything that we believe as far as the ability to go to God for forgiveness comes downstream from the ability to have that Holy of Holies.
In John 16, Jesus says, this is verse 7, he says, I tell you the truth, it's expedient for you that I go away, for if I don't go away, the Comforter will not come to you. But if I depart, I will send him unto you. So did Jesus go away and depart?
Well, he said he would, yes.
So is Christ truly departed and gone away?
In what sense do you mean?
In the sense that he meant when he said it in John 16.
Well, yeah, because when he was going to depart and go away, he was talking about throwing off his physical body. But obviously he didn't even mean that permanently, because he later appeared to these same men in his resurrected body.
So do you believe that the Comforter came before the ascension?
I believe it came after the resurrection.
Before the ascension?
Okay. I'm sorry. Now I know what your question is now. I'm dumb. No, it was after the ascension.
Okay. So then the going away is the ascension, right?
No, because the going away, what he's talking about is actually happening. Well, maybe I have my timeline wrong. Are you quoting from something before or after the crucifixion? Because I think if I remember correctly, this is before that scene. Am I wrong?
John 16 is before the death of Christ.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what he meant. Christ actually had to die. He had to go into the realm of death and harrow out hell. Okay, he had to physically leave them and spiritually leave them for a while before he could resurrect again. That leaving part, it's not referring to the ascension. It's referring to the immediate crucifixion, and the Comforter he sends thereafter happens after the ascension, and that's why we get the day of Pentecost that happens.
When Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:8 says, "We're confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord," is Paul suggesting that he's not present with the Lord in that sense now?
No.
All right. You in John 4:23-24, Jesus is responding to the Samaritan woman. He says, "But the hour comes, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, because the Father seeks such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." What was the point of Jesus mentioning that to the Samaritan woman?
The point of Jesus mentioning that to the Samaritan woman was the throwing down of boundaries, because again, Samaritans actually are Jews. They are just Jewish people that never left Israel during the Babylonian captivity. And what ended up happening is that there later was artificial barriers created by the rabbinic system and the native Samaritans of Judah. And when he said that they are to worship in spirit and truth, he is referring to a time where you no longer have to go to Mount Gerizim or to the Temple of Jerusalem, where God becomes universalized. You no longer have to go to these specific idols at these specific places and offer these specific sacrifices. Jesus himself becomes the sacrifice. He becomes the Holy of Holies. The fact he came into the world as flesh, as quite literally an incarnation, an icon of God himself, is suggestive of that. He is referring to the tearing down of the boundaries that had defined her worship of God.
So I hope I'm probably going to butcher the terminology you're using in your presentation, but you had kind of used presence as a verb and said that certain things presence God under the Old Testament. And would you agree then that in this context where he's contrasting the Gerizim worship to the Jerusalem worship, that he's saying that this time of these physical things presencing God are going away in favor of spiritual worship?
No, the reason is because you cannot come to that conclusion without putting your own eisegesis in there. You have to therefore already presuppose that to worship in spirit and truth therefore means non-physical worship, or that physical media is reduced. Nothing about what Jesus said, just taken on his own premises, would conclude that without you presupposing those in there from the beginning.
Well, I mentioned that God is a spirit in that case then.
Well, Jesus mentioned God was a spirit, certainly, but at no point does that therefore conclude that the physicality in worshiping him or the presencing of himself in physical space would therefore end. That's something you have to presuppose about your own theology into the text in order to make the text draw that out.
So I understand my view, but I'm asking now more, not so much why you're not buying into my view, but what is the reason on your view that Jesus mentions that God is a spirit here after being asked about where's the right place for people to worship.
Repeat the question again. I
So
apologize.
the Samaritan woman asks, where should we worship, Jerusalem or this mountain? And
Yes.
Jesus' answer is, God is a spirit. Why is that an answer to the question she's asking?
That is a question of the answer she's asking because a time is coming where God will no longer be limited to those places, where anywhere Jesus is, anywhere the Eucharist is where God will also be. Case in point, Jesus says this is one of the parts where Jesus himself is an idol of God, because he talks to, I forget who this was, maybe Thomas, maybe someone else. He looks to someone, or maybe it's Philip. He says, show us the Father. And he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Now, if we were to take that straight forward, Jesus is a heretic, because that's clearly not true in a Trinitarian perspective. But if we take seriously the idea that idols actually presence God, Jesus himself is bearing God's name and therefore presences God. The Eucharist that he instituted therefore presences Jesus. And so in whatever way you go, wherever you have the Eucharist, wherever you have a congregation of Christians, you will have the presence of God there. It will no longer be restricted to Mount Gerizim. It will no longer be restricted to the Temple Mount. It will be wherever you have a priest, wherever you have a Eucharist, God will be there with you.
It seems like your answer is that the physical presence at Jerusalem or the physical presence at Gerizim is going away because of Jesus' physical presence through the Eucharist being all over the earth. But if that's the case, then I'm curious, what does that have to do with God being spirit?
Because it has to do with the universalization of the worship of God. Okay, God can be spirit, but that doesn't mean his spirit's going to be everywhere. Okay, in fact, like here's the thing: the New Testament is very clear about this, especially in the Gospels. The idea that God could only be encountered in the Holy of Holies. His spiritual presence doesn't alter that reality. What alters that is the crucifixion of Christ and the resurrection, the one sacrifice for all, where the presence of God no longer needs to be in that place exclusively. It can be in all places wherever there is a Eucharist.
I'd like to come back to your argument. If I understand it, you have your position is that implicit, because of all the numerous New Testament passages that you say presuppose a New Testament priesthood.
And they do. Go ahead.
So in view of that, what I wanted to do is you had mentioned that there's authority structures. We talked about that. You mentioned forgiveness of sins. We talked about that. What about the other things that are the main focus of this presupposition? In other words, like I think you mentioned keys being somehow uniquely priestly.
They are. Isaiah 22.
Isaiah 22, it says that these are, let's look at that.
I think it's Isaiah 20. I'm pretty sure it's Isaiah 22, but go ahead.
It says, Isaiah 22:22 says, and the key of the house of David will I lay on his shoulder. Is your position that David had priesthood authority?
What that means, actually, it's actually a good thing you brought that up. What's going on is that in Isaiah, when the king was leaving the kingdom, diplomatically or maybe going on vacation, who knows, right? He would take a whole entourage with him, and the person that would be in charge of the kingdom would be the high priest that the key of the king was laid upon. Here, Jesus takes on the role of king and lays the key upon his apostles, meaning they become high priests, or they become priests themselves, right? And so they are to govern in his stead while he's gone. This was, of course, referring to the ascension, where he promised to come back.
So in Isaiah 22:15, the Shebna is described as being the treasurer over the house of, looks like over his house. I assume the house
Correct.
of David.
That's because because in ancient times, temples were more than just places you went to worship. They were actually, they were banks. Okay. They were also the ones responsible for collecting taxes. To be a treasurer also meant you were probably a priest too, but go ahead.
So your position that Shebna is also, although it doesn't seem he's ever described as anything other than a treasurer, your position is that he is actually a high priest or priest.
Probably at least a priest. Like he might not be called that, but for him to be the treasurer of a temple means he's probably a priest of some kind here. It would be very strange for him to be anything else and be a treasurer in this time period.
In Revelation 3:7, this key of David that was mentioned in Isaiah 22:22 is mentioned again, and it says this: "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he that's holy, he that's true, he that has the key of David, he that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens." Do you agree that this is referring to Jesus here?
I'm not familiar enough with that particular text to actually answer that, but so I'm going to say I don't know. But I'm going to say, given what the author often is, given what he's interested in, he's probably talking about Jesus in that specific context.
Okay, so if Jesus has assumed, for the sake of argument, if this is referring to Jesus, and then doesn't it say that he still has this key, that it has, in other words, that it hasn't been given away?
Oh yeah, of course, because when the king gives authority to the high priest to rule, and this is an authority that could only be given to high priests, okay? It doesn't mean the king suddenly loses his authority because he's vacationing in Miami, okay? He's still king. And so Jesus, who gave the key to begin with, is the one that has that kingly authority. He doesn't lose it just because he left for a while.
Okay, let's see. I think that any other questions I have would probably take more than a minute to answer, so we can yield back any remaining time at this point.
Okay.
T-Fan and Fro, that flew by. That was nearly an hour of fast-paced cross-examination. Excellent endurance. I really enjoyed that. To the audience, send in those last-minute questions. I am all caught up on your questions with super chats bumped to the top. Okay, we have our 7-minute closing statement. So there's been a lot discussed, a lot of points brought up, some excellent discussion, great opportunity to bring everything home, land the plane on our respective positions here tonight to give the audience the best possible representation of those positions here tonight. Reminder to the audience, the debate resolution: is the Roman Catholic priesthood valid? Fro, you get the first 7 minutes. I'm just getting my timer going.
Okay.
And
hold up. Let me get all my notes together here. All right. I am starting right now. Okay. I'm glad you were here for us, ladies and gentlemen. First, I just want to point out that the whole crux of my opponent's argument is that God did not ordain the Roman Catholic priesthood, and a lot of the proof arguments he made was the violation of priestly ordination, such as Korah's rebellion or Cain's sacrifice or things of that nature. But at no point has that actually been demonstrated as a deficiency within the priesthood. His argument is, we don't see explicit ordination in the Bible, therefore it didn't happen. Meanwhile, however, both the texts of Hebrews 7, 10, Corinthians, and significant other places, the priesthood language of the authority that God establishes and bestows upon his own apostles, the fact that they lay on hands and choose successors, the fact that significant scenes are also operant in ordination ceremonies of the Old Covenant, the preponderance of evidence here is that there's certainly a priesthood that is, or at least a ministry that's answering the same purpose as priest. Additionally, the thing of it is, he talks about vocabulary as if that means anything in the today, because it really doesn't. Like, our vocabulary has changed so much. Apostle does not mean to Paul what it means to us, nor for that matter does overseer or deacon. These things have changed and their meanings have changed. The inability to recognize that, I think, is probably the weakest part of his argument. But additionally, even the things Paul describes already presuppose that there is a priesthood operating in these contexts, because otherwise what's making the sacrifice? All right, it has to be something that is meeting these standards. And thus far, he's invented quite a few interesting ways of ignoring that. And I'd probably do the same in his shoes, right? But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't exactly address much. The other thing about that is, I have explained at length that the way in which God communes with his people is by using physical mediation. In other words, idolatry, idols. And that seems to be completely abandoned in my opponent's worldview, where the physicality of things itself is now denied. And on one hand, that appears to me as a rather Gnostic in thought. But on another hand, that also appears to essentially be creeping way too close to Marcionism, where God just changes so catastrophically and just so immediately between old and new, that I hardly think that the theologies between the New Testament and the Old Testament can follow, much less what his ecclesiology would allow in comparison to either. Because if there is no ministerial priesthood, if the logic of idolatry, of physical mediation, is no longer operant in Christianity, then we don't have a claim to the old covenant. You might as well just be Jewish, because the point stands, therefore, that religious Jews will ultimately make, that Christianity is a mutation, an alteration of what actually was true and holy religion. And if TurretinFan is correct, then so are the Jews. You shouldn't be Christian. You ought to just remain Jewish. You ought to be back in there, because what you're dealing with is substantially a different God. Either God is schizophrenic, there's a different God, or God actually can change. And either scenario is not actually a position that any Christian would validly take. But additionally, I'm not even asking him to call the Catholic priesthood correct. I'm not even asking him in any way, shape, or form to say that our priests are valid priests. That's not the subject of the argument. He can still deny the priesthood, and I'm not going to ask him to abandon his traditions by accepting the priesthood. What I'm asking him to do is merely to validate it, that when you look at the biblical evidence, when you see how God communes with his people, the logic of physical mediation, and the way in which the Catholic priesthood has logically fulfilled that through the ministry of Jesus Christ, that even if it's not true, even if it's not a true priesthood, it's at least a valid one. I'm not asking him in any way, shape, or form to accept this. I'm asking him merely to validate that. And I don't think that's a big concession I'm asking for. I think that's going to be wrap up for my closing argument. I'm glad everyone was here. I'm glad we all enjoyed ourselves. And I guess we can enjoy the last hour for audience Q&A and whatever closing argument my opponent has. You can take the screen back, Donnie.
Fro, thank you very much for that roughly 5 to 7 minute closing statement. TurretinFan, we will now reset the timer. Whenever you're ready, please let me know. To the audience, I am all caught up on your questions. I look forward to seeing how our guests tonight are going to answer and engage them. So T-Fan, I see you going full screen. 7 minutes for a closing statement. Feel free to begin whenever you'd like to. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. It's hard to sum up a debate of this length in 7 minutes, but I hope that I have helped you, the audience, to understand why the Roman Catholic priesthood is invalid. Of course, from my standpoint, the main issue is, in order for it to be valid, God would have to ordain it. And the evidence offered that God ordained it, from the standpoint of the negative side here, it seems to me extremely tenuous. We saw some claims made that it's presupposed by numerous texts, but as we dug into those texts, we saw either that it just presupposes that Christ is the priest who's offered a sacrifice, or that there's authority in the church. There's someone's not muted, I think, in the background.
That's my fault. Sorry.
No worries. So either that there's authority in the church, but in some cases we're told that there's markers of a priesthood continuing, like forgiving sins. And yet we saw that forgiving sins is a Christian duty that all Christians have, that we all ask for forgiveness from God, that we're told to do that by Jesus in the Lord's Prayer. That's our model of prayer. That's how we should worship, is the way Jesus taught us. That's part of our worship of God, is asking him for the forgiveness of our sins, and that we can forgive other Christians their sins against us. The idea that there's some additional priestly duties presumed in the New Testament just doesn't follow. There's an inference drawn by Fro that there's a need for priests based on from my standpoint, just an absence of teaching. And when we started to push back on things like, well, aren't the keys for everybody? And the answer seemed to be, well, there only just seemed to be that there was an appeal to the explicit teachings. That, well, it's said that there's given it to the apostles, but there's nothing said about whether it's also given to everybody or something like this, or that some people's feet are washed, which is like a priestly rite, and yet other people's feet are washed in the New Testament, and we're supposed to care for one another. And what the apostles received, they were supposed to do for others as well. They were supposed to serve just as Christ served, in that the one who's the minister should be serving everyone. In fact, this is sort of not a controversial take on that passage, that this principle of service is to be done even by those who are viewed as having authority in the church. They ought to serve others. I pointed out that the principle that God's worship requires divine authorization is an Old Testament principle. Now, my opponent doesn't accept sola scriptura, that it has to be taught by Scripture in order for us to accept it. I didn't insist that he show it from Scripture for this debate, but I don't think he did show it from Scripture, and he didn't show it from something other than Scripture. He didn't say that there's this other thing out there that shows that Jesus started a new priesthood at a specific time. He asserted that he thought it was implied in the Lord's Supper, but if you read through the accounts of the Lord's Supper, he doesn't ordain a new priesthood there. He doesn't explain how the people who participate in the Lord's Supper, which is all believers now, we all participate in the Lord's Supper, how that therefore is a distinctive priestly role. Presumably he means consecrating as a distinctly priestly role, but that's not something that's described in the Last Supper. That some people, some subset of the believers are responsible for consecrating. And also, just the mere consecration of bread doesn't seem to be a distinctly priestly role. But we would need to see, in order to establish that the validity, we need to see a positive argument for the validity. Now, there was a question about, well, what about this idolatry? He was willing to use the word idolatry in some kind of positive way. I'm sort of biting my tongue because of I frequently accuse Roman Catholicism of practicing actual idolatry by worshiping bread, actual idolatry by worshiping statues, and so forth. But he's saying some idolatry is sanctioned, and he reviews some of these other things as constituting some form of idolatry. My point is, we do need to see why is there a change in the way that worship practices in the Old Testament. We need to see the basis for that difference. Why is the Old Testament worship different than New Testament worship? But the answer comes down to things like Jesus saying that God is a spirit, and that there's going to be a change from the worship that's Jerusalem-based, that has this temple in Jerusalem where the sacrifices are performed, that because God is spirit, there's going to be a change in the way that God is worshipped, because he wants to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. We see that the book of Hebrews explains that this Old Testament priesthood is no more. And in its place, the author of Hebrews doesn't describe a multi-level human priesthood, but he merely describes Christ, who offers the one sacrifice once for all time, thereby doing away with the need for additional priests. There is no need for additional priests, partly because Jesus is immortally priest, partly because he's done all the sacrificing that needs to be done. It's already been completed. And he's performing the other priestly role of intercession on our behalf on an ongoing basis. All these things are there in the New Testament. The New Testament shows us, therefore, that there is a new priesthood. It has been changed. The change, though, is from these human priests to the God-man, Jesus Christ, as our high priest. And yes, there's a sense in which we're all priests. A nation of priests is one of those passages, but also we're also called as priests in Revelation as well. So, to sum it all up, I hope that you're following along with me that the Roman Catholic priesthood lacks divine warrant. Therefore, on that basis alone, it's invalid, even if there's nothing else to invalidate it beyond that. Thanks very much for your time.
TurretinFan, thank you very much for that closing statement. Gentlemen, fantastic debate. That concludes opening statements, rebuttals, an extensive cross-exam, nearly 60 minutes. I think that's required for a debate of this magnitude on such a good resolution and closing statements. We now have some good questions to help make this debate that much more comprehensive on the Roman Catholic priesthood. Gentlemen, clearly you both put in the necessary amount of work and study to give us a thought-provoking exchange. So thank you for that. Let's start at the beginning. Whoever the question's for gets the last word, gentlemen, as we usually do. That way we'll be able to move forward, but also give you guys the opportunity on every question to both give your thoughts and rebuttals and so on. Katrina Cook, thank you very much. Sister, great to see you as always in our live chat. $10 super chat. I appreciate it. Excuse me, Fro. We've got 1 Peter 2:5. Okay, let's see what she has. Ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house, an holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices, acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Please explain this verse.
Nah, she got my name wrong. She doesn't deserve an answer. Sure. We kind of covered that in the debate, Katrina. That has virtually nothing to do with a kind of ministerial priesthood. And for the same reasons I mentioned, it's quoting from Exodus 19. It is talking, Exodus 19 is referring to an identity marker. Israel becomes a kingdom of priests because it's from the kingdom of Israel God gathers his priests from, and specifically the tribe of Levi. And this is well after the actual Aaronic priesthood was already established. No one was doing the sacrifices that Aaron was, like at all. This was an identity marker for who was and was not the people of God. And even in the context of 1 Peter 2, it's essentially talking about that. It is advocating for the validity of the New Testament, okay? And the validity that the Gentiles are as much as God's people as the Jews under Moses was. And so this has little to do with ministerial priests, as evidenced by where it's quoting. It's an identity marker for the people of God.
Thank you, Fro.
Mm-hmm.
Turretin, over to you.
So the text of 1 Peter 2:5 is, you also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. And the one aspect that I would love if Fro's willing to do so, would be to focus on this spiritual sacrifices, because I sort of remember receiving some kind of flack about Protestant spiritual sacrifices not being real sacrifices. But it's plural here, spiritual sacrifices plural. What are these spiritual sacrifices then in this text under Fro's view? That would be my question to Fro.
Mm-hmm. Well, that typically refers to the things that you would offer up to God, because case in point, in the Old Covenant, right? The priest didn't take a sheep from his own flock. You took the best of your own and offered that up. Okay, that's what's going on here. To offer up spiritual sacrifices, there's a reason they're kind of called spiritual and not just sacrifices, because First Peter operates under the premise that there's no more need for blood sacrifices. And so this again reinforces the identity marker, where the people of God had to take the best of their own flock and offer that to the priest to be sacrificed. Something similar is going on here, where they themselves are in that new covenant. They are to do in a spiritual way what the actual children of Israel were doing in a literal way, because they are no less the people of God. Again, this has very little to do with an actual sacrifice or actual priests. This has to do with what is an identity marker, who belongs, who is inside, and who is out. That's what it refers to.
Thank you, Fro, for that last word. Okay, next question here comes in from, just grab it, Malachi, $5 super chat. Thank you very much. To Fro, you mentioned that God was wherever the Eucharist was. Do you believe God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent at all times?
Well, the simple answer is no. God can be omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent at all times. Is a different matter entirely, because obviously no one's going to deny that he is God. He's the creator, and he has complete agency and independence over his creation. But he is more present in some places than others, and he has to be in order to be what he claims to be, which is a father to his people. He has a people whom he has called to himself, and he communes with that people. That's why in the Old Testament, you didn't just kill an animal and offer the blood. You ate it in the presence of God. It was you in your father's house, dining with your father. That's what God is. God is a father to Israel, and therefore his holy places, his sanctuaries, is where his presence is more than any other place he could be, because that's the nature of familial relation. That is what it is to have a people, to take on a God that is yours, who is responsible for your religion, your nation, your people, your race. It is that intimacy that is required. So to answer your question bluntly, God could be omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent at all times. He just chooses not to be. He chooses to be all those things with us.
T-Fan, over to you.
Well, I would disagree with that answer in the sense that it's simply the case that God is immutably always and has always been omniscient, omnipotent, and he's omnipresent, having created local places that God, because God's without extension, he's also omnipresent by definition. The sense in which he's omnipresent when there's no location is a little different or difficult to understand perhaps, but he's always all of those omnis. There's no time when he's not. But there is also senses in which God's presence there's a special presence of God that's distinct from just his general omnipresence, like when Jesus says, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them.
Hey.
That kind of presence of God is different from just his general omnipresence. There's nowhere you can escape God's presence. If you go into hell or into the heavens, if you go to the moon, God's still there. There's nowhere you can escape the presence of God. You may, like Jonah, you may try to escape the presence of God, but you can't actually escape the presence of God. But nevertheless, there are special senses of God's presence, and the gathering of believers is one of those places. And that's a distinction. This idea that there's sacred places not like Jerusalem was anymore, because God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So we may have reserved buildings for worship, but God is not present in those spaces the way that he was in the temple in the Old Testament.
Thank you, T-Fan. Fro, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was just a bit of a straw man. I don't deny that God cannot be in all places and all times and know all things and have all power. I never denied that. He could be on the moon if he wanted to be. He could be in hell if he wanted to be. He could be on all places if he wanted to be. That wasn't the argument I made. And quite frankly, saying that he's in all places at all times just contradicts what the New Testament shows about his relationship with his people. He is more present in his sanctuaries with the people he called to himself, and he's less present in every other place that aren't those places. That was the whole thing. Case in point, what TurretinFan appealed to is actually Jesus outing himself as an idol of God, because Jesus, when he says that where 2 or 3 gather in my name, I am with him, he himself is referring to the Mishnah, because the Mishnah's idol is the Torah, and it says where 2 or 3 come together to read and study the Torah, the presence of Yahweh is amongst them. Here, Jesus is replacing himself with the idol of Rabbinic Judaism, which is the Torah, as in the presence, he is able to presence God. Interestingly enough, TurretinFan just selected another verse that actually demonstrates the whole sanctioned idolatry model I've been arguing all night here, and it's been wonderfully confirmed even by my opponent for quite some time here in distinct ways. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Fro and T-Fan, for those responses. Another one comes in from Katrina Cook. Thank you very much, Katrina. $20 super chat, much appreciated. Fro, but this man, because he continueth, and because she got your name right this time, Fro, now you're obligated to answer the question, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Hebrews 7:4. Catholic priests claim to stand in place of Jesus for the laity, changing his priesthood contrary to this verse. Please justify.
So I think there's a bit of a incoherence here, but this man, because he continued forever, he's referring to Jesus. Okay, never mind. Yeah. So this is the thing. All right. This comes down to part of what's the identity collapse, because even in order to be a priest, in order to be an idol of God, there's often an identity collapse where there's a point in which the Ark of the Covenant, the temple, even the bronze serpent actually presents God. And in that way, the identity of the idol and the identity of God collapse in on themselves. Something like that is going on here. Okay. Jesus does have an unchangeable priesthood, but Jesus, being an idol of God, has also collapsed the distinction between himself as idol and the presence of God himself. And so something very similar happens when we talk about Catholic priests, because the Eucharist presences Jesus, and the Catholic priests, having the authority of Jesus, it collapses their own identities into Jesus's identity. Case in point, the doctrines of Alter Christus and In Persona Christi, these are not late or medieval accretions. We have these teachings almost idea for idea within the early church, within 2 centuries of the ministry of Jesus Christ. Ignatius of Antioch, Irenaeus of Lyon, John Chrysostom, they all attest to this. It's not even up for debate. It's not even controversial. So what goes on here is that to be an idol, to be a priest, is to stand in place of something, because that's how presencing works. And so the priesthood isn't contrary to this verse. The priesthood requires that verse. It requires that stand-in, because if that identity collapse doesn't happen, it fails as an idol, and therefore you fail as a priest.
Thank you, Fro, for the last word there. Next question comes in from Skittle Chan. Question for Fro.
Donny?
Yeah, no, Turretin didn't get to answer that last one.
Oh, I'm sorry. T-Fan, Yes, let me get that back up. And okay.
We're ignoring you, buddy. You don't even get to speak.
Oh, T-Fan, we forgot you were here. Okay, T-Fan.
Well, Katrina's doing an effective job, I guess. But and the minor correction to this comment was that it should be, she means 7:24 as opposed to 7:4. But anyway, the contrasting 24 is with verse 23. 23 says, they truly were many priests, because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death, but this man, because he continues ever, has an unchangeable priesthood. Wherefore, in the verse 25, he's able to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever lives to make intercession for them. And it goes on in 26, for such a high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. Now, these things are not the case, that Roman Catholic priests are not made higher than the heavens. They're not holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners. In fact, all of them are, as Romans teaches us, all of us are sinners. All human beings are sinners. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Roman Catholic priests as though they're somehow notoriously bad sinners, but I'm just saying they fall short of the holiness of God.
Yep.
And therefore, this priesthood, that's the New Testament priesthood, this unchangeable priesthood, is something that's only the office of Jesus Christ. There are no other, these many priests. That's referring not to the New Testament, that's referring to the Old Testament. That's what I think ultimately Katrina is getting at with this question, that his unchangeable priesthood is held only by him.
Thank you, T-Fan. Fro, you get the last word. Go ahead.
All right. So this is also answerable through the doctrines of alter Christus and in persona Christi, because these things still apply. What goes on, in order to be a priest, right, it requires nonetheless still that identity collapse, where you're taking on the the divinity that you're presencing in some way. And so, yeah, when we claim that Jesus is all of those, at least in the actions of liturgy, at least when the priest is saying the Mass, when he's forgiving sins, when he's performing sacraments, when he's baptizing or in other liturgical acts, it's not the priest doing that. It is Jesus doing that through and by the priest. The priest is presencing Jesus. So what we claim here in Hebrews 7:24 maps on perfectly all the more. But ideally, this would actually be incoherent if there wasn't a understanding that priests could presence Jesus, because if Jesus has an unchangeable priesthood and he's a high priest, who are these perfect priests being talked about? Well, that doesn't make sense without the presencing logic behind this. Next question.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen, to the both of you. So the next question I had up was, there we go. Skittle Chan for Fro. How do you respond to this objection? For there is one God and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. 1 Timothy 2:5. How do you exegete that in light of your position, Fro?
So I'm not sure how or why he's trying to ask that. If he's trying to say about criticize icon veneration or try to criticize something referring to icon veneration, I'm not sure what this has to do with the debate, but he might be referring to the idea of priestly intercessors. So I'm just going to argue from there. Well, the fact is, this is simply a reflection of what goes on with the angel of the Lord passages, the passages where the angels of the Lord just collapse straight into God. By bearing God's name, they bear his identity to the point they just collapse into one another. That's what happens with the Sodom cycle, where the angels of the Lord that visit Lot are later revealed just to be God himself. And so similarly, what goes on here is that when a priest takes on his sacred duties, when he acts sacramentally, he actually is becoming Jesus in a meaningful way, where his identity is supplanted by Christ's identity, where Christ is doing the things that the priest is doing because their identities have collapsed. That's what the doctrines of Alter Christus and In Persona Christi are claiming. And so the one mediator between God and men still apply, because it is the fact that God himself comes down to mediate. Additionally, in the very context of the verse, that's actually even referring to a salvation where Jesus Christ himself has mediated between us and God, our salvation, our belonging to the new covenant. So even in the context of this verse, that's even a bit even farther removed from the debate topic, but that's what I got for now. Let's see what Turretin has to say.
Turretin, over to you.
I think the objection, and the implied objection here, would be that priests seem to be, in the Roman Catholic priesthood, serving a mediatorial role between God and men, and that that seems to contradict this verse, at least on its face, that either there's one mediator or there are many mediators. And the idea that there could this collapse argument may be appealing, but if it works for the Old Testament priesthood as well, then it's unclear how there's something in that case, how there's a significance to Christ's uniqueness. In other words, the idea that Christ is uniquely a mediator between God and man, that there's one God and one mediator between God and man. That uniqueness of Christ was taken away if that's also true of all the high priests that have ever been and all the priests that have ever been during the Old Testament period. Then to say that there's just one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, it would be destroyed. But the real meaning, of course, of the text is that Jesus Christ has a unique role, and that role is his role. It is this priestly role, and specifically, as it goes on to say in the next verse, who gave himself a ransom for all. That giving himself of a ransom for all is that priestly role where he's the sacrifice and the person performing the sacrifice, and that he does that on behalf of his people. And that's ultimately why this verse is significant to this particular discussion.
Thank you. T-Fan Fro, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Yeah, the reason this appears, so first of all, I would actually agree with Turretin on this. The very context of this probably has very little to do with the identity collapse of priests, but I'm kind of going to assume for the sake of argument it does, because this was the question that was asked of me. Normally, I wouldn't go to this text to demonstrate that. But two things here. First of all, the context of this verse is actually the fact that it's Jesus mediating salvation to us. And you only need to go a couple verses behind in order to demonstrate that. Anybody with eyes can see that. And I know TurretinFan has eyes, so I know he can see that too. So we'd agree there is a uniqueness of Christ being expressed here because it's expressed in salvation. Be that as it may, the reason what I'm describing is actually being incomprehensible to him or incoherent is because fundamentally his tradition has foregone and anathematized any idea that there's a holy of holies, that the presence of God could actually dwell with us. Even in an earlier audience question, he more or less kind of gave the game away, where by basically saying that God is present at all times in all places, seemingly without qualification, because as far as he's concerned, worship can happen in a sewer, in a house, in a dumpster, and basically anywhere in the middle of nowhere, in the woods or the desert, okay? That's not how historic Christianity has understood worship. It requires sacred space to be made. And so this is incoherent to him because his tradition has foregone any idea that the Holy of Holies could still be amongst us. Historic and apostolic Christianity has done no such thing. But when you take those premises, this makes so much more sense then.
Thank you, Fro. Okay, this next one's for both. And so to be fair, Fro, I think you got the last word in the first 3 or 4 questions.
Francis can go first. I don't mind.
What we'll do, since it's a question for both, that means one response each. Fro, let's start with you. And then that way TFan can get the second response and therefore the last word. And so this comes in from Ashley Myers. Thank you very much, Ashley. Here's the question. Wasn't Jesus a priest after the order of Melchizedek, not the Levitical priesthood, a priesthood that never ends? We never had any evidence of lower priests under Melchizedek, did we?
Who goes first? Oh yeah, Francis.
Yeah,
first.
we'll have you, Fro.
Okay, I'm confused. Am I going first or Francis? I don't get it.
Well, here I'll reiterate. So because it's a question for both, that means we get one response each, so 2 instead of 3. Therefore, gotcha. Fro, let's start with you, and then that way TFan can.
I get now. So first of all, there's a presupposition being made here, and that is that the order of Melchizedek has nothing to do with the same mechanisms we see in the Levitical priesthood. That's not something you're ever going to find in the New Testament, but that is a presupposition that your theology has to bear the weight of. Similarly, this is the thing. If Jesus Christ is a high priest, and he's never called the only priest, just the high priest, that already presupposes there are agents underneath him serving as lower priests. And more to the point, the theology behind Hebrews is not that there's no ministerial priesthood. It's just that the ministerial priesthood of Melchizedek of the New Testament is superior. It's better. And therefore, the implication is that in so many other ways, it's going to be the same priesthood operating with those similar mechanics that the Aaronic Levitical priesthood did. The difference is that it's no longer genealogical. It can be universal. The difference is that the presence of the Lord is no longer behind a curtain, okay? And it's no longer a place where only a priest can go. You can actually touch this presence of God. You can eat the sacrifice that is the presence of God in the bread and drink it in the wine. And so it's superior because that veil that was unique and restricted only to priests has been rent for us, where we can be in the presence of it and actually have communion and materiality, physical contact with it. Go ahead, Turretin.
So, I mean, obviously I agree with Ashley's premise. It states in Hebrews 7 that there's in verse 12, it says the priesthood being changed. There's of necessity a change in the law also. And then it says that Jesus came out of Judah, which about Moses said nothing about Judah having the priesthood. And then verse 15, yet it's far more evident for that after the similitude of Melchizedek, there's another priest that has arisen, who's made not after the law of carnal commandment, but by the power of an endless life. Because he testifies, referring to the Psalms, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Therefore, there's verily a disannulling of the commandment going before for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. For the law being made perfect, made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by which we draw near unto God. And so the priesthood has changed from the Levitical priesthood to another priest, singular, Hebrews 7:15, who's after the similitude of Melchizedek. That's the change. And he's a priest forever. There's no need for additional priests. There's no need for subsequent priests. There's no need for priests after him. And there's no need for any other priests to offer up sacrifices because there's only one sacrifice, and this priest has done it. So there's, obviously I agree with what Ashley has said.
Okay, very good. Thank you, TFan. You get the last word. Next question comes in from Spiritual Theology of Christ. $5 super chat. Thank you very much. Question for Fro. If the temple, law, king sacrifice, feast days, circumcision, seed, land, etc. were fulfilled spiritually, why doesn't typology apply to the priesthood?
Well, it does. That's why the priesthood, that's why, for instance, you can actually have communion with God face to face without the need of a temple veil. Our Holy of Holies is the Eucharist precisely because the priesthood was fulfilled in typology. It was the very act that in the prophets they had said that a day would come where the Lord would gather all nations to himself. The fulfillment of that is the church. And so all of these things were fulfilled spiritually. What I think is a premise that might be getting snuck in here, and spiritual theology of Christ is going to have to correct me, is the idea that therefore the spiritual fulfillment is equivalent to the going away of these things or being altered beyond recognition. Well, he mentioned circumcision. I'll give an example of that. Circumcision never really went away in Christianity. That just became baptism. The New Testament is very clear on that. And the way that you entered into the old covenant through and by circumcision, or marriage if you were a woman, that's how baptism is how you enter into the new covenant as anybody. The way you enter to become one of God's people is to be baptized. That took the place of circumcision, but similarly, the priesthood kind of changed the same way. But notice, they're still the same entry point. Circumcision was the entrance into the covenant, okay? That still makes it the entry. Similarly, the priesthood has changed quite a bit from the Aaronic and Levitical systems. They're still priests. They still offer sacrifice. That's all I got to say right now.
T-Fan, over to you.
So I'm not 100% sure the perspective that spiritual theology of Christ is coming from, but
neither did I.
But typology does apply to the Levitical priesthood. The replacement of the Levitical priesthood is Christ, the better priest. That's the replacement of that. There are bloody signs in the Old Testament that have been replaced by unbloody signs, like baptism, which is not bloody, replaced circumcision, which was very bloody. The Lord's Supper, which is not bloody, replaces the Passover, which was bloody. But there's those two signs, baptism and the Lord's Supper, that we still have. But my question, I don't know why he says it doesn't apply to the priesthood, or I'm not sure exactly what he means by it. So I feel like I can't completely advocate for the question on this point, and I'll just yield back the mic to Fro for the final word.
Fro, over to you.
Honestly, I don't have I don't actually have a response. I don't have another reply to that, because I think I just said my piece. TurretinFan said his, and we disagree, but that was already established. So just get to the next one, I suppose.
Okay, next one comes in from Peter Junk, $5 super chat. Thank you for the question. Deuteronomy 13 says if a prophet changes the commandments, they're false. Which prophet do Catholics and Protestants follow after the Sunday Sabbath?
Okay.
I guess he's not really specifying. So.
Yeah, so one each, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
And last time Fro had to go first, so I guess I have to go first on this one.
Go ahead.
All right. So if a prophet changes the commandments, they're false. Is that what it says in Deuteronomy 13? So it says if there's a prophet or a dreamer of dreams that gives a sign or wonder, and the sign or wonder comes to pass, and he says, let's go after other gods, which you haven't known, and serve them, then you shouldn't hearken to him, because the God's testing you. And if the prophet tells you to go out of the way which the Lord your God commanded you to walk in, then you're supposed to go against them. But on the other hand, the difference between those prophets and Jesus Christ is that Jesus Christ is God. The commandments that are the commandments of God are the commandments of Jesus Christ. And so the reason why Christians meet for assembly on Sunday rather than on Saturday, not that Saturday meetings are forbidden, but the reason that we do it on Sunday is because of the commandment of the Lord, because we are remembering his resurrection. That's why some countries will call it the Lord's Day. In Spanish, it's Domingo, which comes from the word for the Lord. In Russian, it's Voskresenia or something like that, which means Resurrection Day. And there's these different Christian nations have come up with different words to describe it. Sunday doesn't really tell you much about it, but the reason why Christians do that is because it's a commandment from the Lord, and we see the apostles themselves following this command in the New Testament when they meet on the first day of the week, which is the day of the week that we call Sunday today, as opposed to the last day of the week, which was Saturday.
Thank you, T-Fan. Bro, over to you.
Yeah, that's actually kind of fascinating because off topic, this is one of the bigger problems for Sola Scriptura, because this is the worship of Sunday is essentially something that you can only establish by appealing to tradition. And the complication of this being the Sabbath is significant, but that's just a really interesting tangent, I find. Now, the thing of it is, Deuteronomy 13 does say if the prophet changes the commandments, they're false. That was specifically prophets of the Old Covenant. The whole point of Christianity, its claim to fame, is by engrossing, by taking all of the races of the world, all nations, and giving them entrance into the people of God. That's the point. And therefore, that requires a new covenant. And the whole rest of the New Testament, everything Paul argues, is basically trying to nail down where the boundaries of this new covenant are. And so it would follow, if you have a new covenant, it would have a new Sabbath, because the Sabbath is kind of what cemented the covenant. It was the central and primal act by which the covenant existed to execute. And so the fact is, if we have a new covenant, you're going to have a new Sabbath. And that was sort of even recognized very early on in Christian history, that Paul didn't even want to touch it. He wanted nothing to do with that debate. And he says as much, because it says, let no man judge you in feasts and meals and nights and in Sabbaths. Meaning you had different Christian groups practicing different Sabbaths. Paul wanted nothing to do with it. And this idea, this instinct of the new Sabbath, comes from the claim of a new covenant. And that's kind of all I got to say about that.
Okay, very good. We got one answer from the both of you, and I'm just trying to look at the
two questions. Yep, I think it's two questions left, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I'm looking at the beginning, because I think there was some questions that were more so clarifying questions about the resolution. So I think we can skip those. Let's see this one. Vent Cath. Let's see. We'll work through this. Considering Calvinists respect the early church fathers, so one for you, T-Fan. How does TurretinFan reconcile his position with the writings of Saint Ignatius, Clement, and Irenaeus?
Good question. So, respecting authors and agreeing with authors on every single point aren't the same thing. So I don't necessarily feel the need that I have to always, on every point, agree with Ignatius, Clement, or Irenaeus. On this particular point, I think it would be challenging to find statements from them suggesting that there's a priesthood that's distinct from the like a laity priesthood distinction in Christianity in that time period. Or, some Roman Catholic historians might be willing to grant. I think of this guy who's questionably Roman Catholic. He calls himself Roman Catholic. I think he attends Mass and so forth. But he has his book called Why Priests, which kind of suggests the answer that he's going for there. But he would acknowledge that there weren't priests in the earliest strata of church history. And happy to go through it. If you look at like Ignatius talking about sacrifice, the most famous quote about Ignatius and sacrifice is he describes himself being martyred as being sacrificed to God. He doesn't seem to have the play. He does have a monoepiscopate kind of church government idea, but he doesn't have a priesthood idea there in the genuine writings of Ignatius.
Thank you, T-Fan. Fro, over to you.
How does to reconcile the position with the writings of Saint Ignatius? Yeah, well, my question is that I think that's probably one academic. I haven't read his work, so I wouldn't even know where to begin to criticize it. So I'm going to answer without having read the book. So there's probably going to be a little bit of ignorance in my answer here. The thing about it is that when we're actually reading these authors, here's something else they do. It's much more complicated than saying they just had no priests. They probably did have priests, so they just called it different things, because up till this point, the vocabulary we used was very different. Again, the difference between bishop and elder wasn't exactly established, and wouldn't be until about the 3rd or 4th century, give or take. Case in point, in the Didache, which is a 2nd century work, it describes traveling prophets. What is that? Well, when you actually read that, it's actually what we might call evangelists today. They call them traveling prophets. And so the fact is, the vocabulary is often very muddy in these early centuries, but what they actually describe reveals more. It's like I said in the beginning of this, words mean basically nothing. They mean as much as the definitions we give them. And when we look at the actions of the New Testament, the sacrifice it describes, when we look at the words of Ignatius, Clement, Irenaeus, they are very clearly advocating that there is a role within the church making some kind of sacrifice. Now, they might not have called it priest. They might not have called it elder. They might have called it something else. But again, that definition fits. They are describing an action that only a priest or an office fulfilling the same role could do. That's precisely why I think it's Irenaeus himself that says you should treat the bishop like Jesus, not as if the bishop is a symbol of Jesus, not as if the bishop is, not as if the bishop just takes the place of Jesus, but as if the bishop is actually Jesus. There is a sense here in which the doctrines of Alter Christus and in persona Christi are being realized in some substantive way. I think I'll end on that.
TFan, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Wait, does he? Was this made to TFan or?
Yep. I'm the Calvinist they have in mind.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, my mistake. Go ahead, TFan.
He's not just a Calvinist, he's the Calvinist. Definite article.
I can't escape it. No matter where I go, people point it out. All right. So
hey, listen, I'm the token Catholic. You're the token Calvinist. We're special.
Apparently. All right. So 1 Clement, chapter 52. It's a pretty short chapter. It's one paragraph. So I'll read this. The Lord, brethren, stands in need of nothing, and he deserves nothing of anyone except that confession be made to him. For, says the elect David, I will confess unto the Lord, and that will please him more than a young bullock that has horns and hooves. Let the poor see it and be glad. And again he says, offer unto God the sacrifice of praise, and pay your vows unto the Most High, and call upon me in the day of your trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. For the sacrifice of God is a broken spirit. So that's what the author of 1 Clement, often traditionally known as Clement, has to say about sacrifice in this New Testament period.
Okay, very good. Thank you, TFan. I think there was one here from Static before we wrap up. Right here. Static 412. Thank you very much for Fro. The Roman Catholic Church forbids marriage for priests. Why do they impose this unbiblical sanction? 1 Timothy 4:3. Also, we see in 1 Timothy that bishops can have a wife.
Okay. So it's kind of interesting here. What we see with 1 Timothy 4:3 is that it does say that bishops should have a wife, because the abolition of the priests from marrying is a discipline it practices. It's not really a doctrine or teaching. It's kind of an ordinary discipline, sort of how monastics would put you on specific diets, okay, because that's necessary for their fasts, for their holiness, okay? But there was also a logic behind this as to why this developed. And it was always kind of present off and on throughout the centuries. Like, it's rare to find a church father, for instance, that was actually married. Very rare. And that was largely because if your duties as priest was tied up with your duties as husband, then your duties are kind of severed, right? You can only serve your community in a particular way. Now, similarly, Orthodox priests, right? They can marry, and they do marry, but bishops don't. And that's because it's the division of your obligations and your responsibilities, where you're going to either be failing one or both of them at the same time. So to kind of put a bow on it, the Roman Catholic Church forbids marriage only because that's a discipline that the church has imposed upon them. That does not therefore mean that's going to be a discipline for all time. I can foresee maybe in a few centuries that goes lax a little bit. But for now, that's not really doctrine. That's kind of just a practice, and it's a rather ancient practice. And so case in point, even Paul, who obviously has authority over the men that we would call bishops, he himself was celibate. In fact, preferred that all men should be celibate. But if you couldn't hack it, so to speak, if you couldn't just accept celibacy, then to marry. But his preference is that priests and bishops ought to be celibate and shouldn't marry, that everything goes for the service of God. And so I hope I answered Static's question well enough. Go ahead, TFan.
TFan, over to you.
Interestingly, the Old Testament priests routinely were married when there was actually a priesthood that God had ordained. Those priests generally were married. There was no prohibition on priests being married in general, and we see John the Baptist's father as an example of a priest who was married. And yes, it's true that forbidding people from marrying is an ancient practice. It's ancient enough that Paul prophesied about that to Timothy, saying that the Spirit expressly speaks that in the latter times some will depart from the faith. And one of the things that's mentioned among those is forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats which God has created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. And these ascetic errors did creep in and have an influence on the church for many centuries, and that was not a good thing. So the fact that there's, we calling it a discipline or whatever you want to call it, it ends up being that the biblical requirements for being an elder are kind of set aside in favor of this disciplinary procedure of having unmarried men running the church.
Fro, you can have the last word. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's kind of a straw man of three different things. First of all, it's a straw man of Catholic priests. Second, it's a straw man of Paul's position himself. And thirdly, it's kind of a straw man of the text in question. Because if you notice, and if you pay attention to 1 Timothy 4:3, it doesn't say that bishops have to be married. It's rather clear about this and more distinct than that. A husband to one wife. The target here is not that you to be married. The target is that you cannot have been divorced. That's the point. Where if you're going to be married, you have to be the husband of one wife. Secondly, TurretinFan is just a position here is utterly incoherent with Paul's own discipline, because Paul himself practiced celibacy and advocated its use with his own followers. Thirdly, the verse he's citing from, where he's prophesying about calling all men to remain celibate, to refuse men to marry, even the most conservative scholars today are able to connect this to a burgeoning Gnosticism that was appearing in and around the time, where the flesh, where materiality was actually being seen as evil, as a corrupting influence. Ironically, this is actually mapping more onto TurretinFan's position, in his position on physicality, than even mine is, okay? But here's what remains. Even if we were to take this as seriously as a criticism, what we're seeing here is Paul criticizing people to abolish the idea of marriage. That's not what Paul does. Paul wants you to be celibate. He would rather you be celibate, but he doesn't abolish marriage. He is responding and condemning people that are doing that. And so to try to paint the Catholic priesthood as even anywhere in light years of approaching this is just a straw man and argumentation, in my opinion. And I think this should be avoided in the future to come.
Okay, thank you very much there, bro. Let's see here. More questions have come in, but I think because we're almost at the hour mark for Q&A, we just hit the 3-hour mark for the debate. We'll go one more, and then...
So is the one more we're going what's on screen now or one later?
Or maybe we can do this one because... Let me see. Let's see what this one says. Isaac, if apostolic succession guarantees the preservation of the apostolic ministry, why do early Christian writers sometimes disagree about the nature of ministry, the Eucharist, or salvation? Let's do that one, Fro. What are your thoughts?
Well, for the same reason that, because we kind of live in the same world that they did. We take for granted just how technologically advanced we become, where we can actually know things that happened 300 years ago. All right. If you're in the first century, all you can know 300 years ago is that Rome existed and that certain major strokes of history has happened. Some of the minor things you don't actually know. And so what goes on is that they do disagree sometimes with the particulars of ministry or the Eucharist or some forms of salvation. But here's the thing, they are unified in other areas. They're unified that there is a salvation and it requires obedience to God in some way. They are in agreement that there is a Eucharist and that the Eucharist does contain the true presence of God in some way. Similarly, they're not even confused about the fact that they might be confused about the minors of priesthood, but they're in large agreement that there is a priesthood and it goes from bishop to priest to deacon, sort of in that order. And so there is some disagreement, and there always will be, but there is also a lot of unity too. Case in point, some of the bishop lists of history we don't have access to because time sort of destroyed those. You'd have a fire, or a city would be conquered and burned to the ground, or you just maybe spill your coffee over it, or a lot of things could happen to these documentations. And so trying to piece together after the fact is going to lead to disagreement. But you also get a wide variety of unification. So it's a much more nuanced picture than what Isaac August is kind of painting here.
Thank you, Fro. T-Fan, go ahead.
The short answer to the question is that having been ordained by a godly man or godly men, there is no guarantee that the person so ordained will likewise be godly, that he will follow the same doctrines of the person who came before him. And that's, or the like. It does not, apostolic succession, if by that you mean the chain of ordination, does not guarantee orthodoxy. If it did, then Jerome wouldn't have written, "The whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian." Obviously, Jerome's taking some hyperbole there, but the point is there were many churches. This is in his dialogue against the Luciferians. There was a time when many of the churches were infected with Arianism, not because their teachers before them were all Arians, going back to the time of the apostles, but because people don't always follow all the teachings that came before them, because there's human beings involved and they're sinners. They fall into temptation. There's many reasons why human beings don't stick with the teachings that they were given them. And it's one of the flaws of oral tradition that it doesn't perpetuate itself reliably down through time, which is why the scriptures are written. That's why Peter wrote the second epistle of Peter, is so that people would have in mind what it is that Peter taught after Peter was gone, because Peter knew that oral tradition is not reliable. And that's the fact that oral tradition is not reliable explains why Christian writers disagree with each other on some things that later Roman Catholicism will insist is an apostolic tradition, even where it can't be established to the satisfaction of Protestants from Scripture.
Fro, you get the last word.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Well, the fact I think very precious little will ever convince a Protestant, and that's not exactly a smear. Wherever identity is concerned, there's so much more going on than just the bare and brute facts of history. Case in point, I demonstrate about 7 different verses where a priesthood is clearly presupposed in a sacrificial context, and I rarely got a better response than nuh-uh. Now, again, I'm not necessarily going to dock Turretin from any of those points. I kind of lived in that world myself. I know what that's like. But this is the thing. When this question is asked, what I notice is that he's immediately kind of assuming something of bad faith. And you know what? There are bad faith actors. And I think Jerome had a right to complain. But I think it's equally the point that people became Arian just in good faith too, just honestly misled. The fact of the matter is Arianism isn't necessarily Arian. We just named it after him. This was something that was going on for some time. And the church did what she always did and did correct herself because she has that charism of infallibility granted to her by her founder. But beyond that, and besides that, what goes on here is that there are bad apples that act in bad faith, and there are good people that act in good faith and come to be heretics, oftentimes through no fault of their own. I mean, let's look at just Origen and Tertullian. They're not considered church fathers. We call them church writers. And that's because almost everything they wrote about, all the major things they had believed, later came to be heresy in retrospect. But they didn't know that then. They were just doing what they knew to do and to being faithful to God in the best way they knew how to be. Similarly, Augustine wrote heresy in quite a few times within his own magnum opus, City of God. He believes things about Christianity that isn't believed by anyone today. And so the thing of it is, I think the problem is that you can't just take these things and imagine bad faith. Even there might be bad faith actors. It's just as likely that these are just misled people that require an infallible God that was kind enough to grant us an infallible church to guide his people into all holiness. And I think that's why I'll end it there.
Okay, gentlemen, that wraps up an excellent Q&A. We went for nearly an hour. Doesn't really feel like it, but that's why I say I look forward to these audience Q&A periods because they really do add to the debate content itself. That is for sure allows you guys to clarify, address additional points, and engage the evidence further. So, okay, is the Roman Catholic priesthood valid? Our debaters here made their cases. They cross-examined each other. They gave opening arguments. They gave rebuttals, closing statements. This was a great debate. Now we leave it up to the audience to analyze the material in this debate in as objective of a manner as possible. So I hope everybody enjoyed this as much as I did. I want to thank the debaters Fro and TurretinFan for their time, not only for the debate, but all the time leading up to it, as I know these debates require a lot of time, work, and effort. Gentlemen, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for having us.
I had a very fun time, and thank you for being such a good opponent, TurretinFan. This was you were absolutely as brilliant as I had thought so last time.
Thanks for your kind words. It was definitely interesting to hear your presentation. I don't think I've ever heard a debate between Roman Catholics and Protestants on this particular topic, and it was great to hear your presentation. I don't know if I've actually heard a presentation from Roman Catholics exactly like what you've just offered.
You're never going to either. I don't actually study apologists to bring about the things I do. I do my own study and bring out what I found. And so
Pro is one of a kind.
Yep.
The one of a kind pro, we'll call, yeah.
Thanks also to the many people who commented. I saw there was over 1,000 comments during the debate. So thanks to people who keep it hopping in the chat.
You both generated a lot of discussion and a debate worth
Yep.
re-listening to, because there's a lot of information there. And for those that might not be as familiar with this topic as they would be with others, there's a lot there to dig into and analyze and reanalyze and think through. And that's what we want. We want information-packed, thought-provoking debate. So, Fro.
Yeah,
Go
because
ahead,
here's the thing.
Go ahead.
As soon as I suggested this debate topic, I knew it would immediately be a firestorm, and the comments section did not disappoint. I am absolutely expecting some of the more mentally unstable amongst us are going to make about 12-hour streams, basically mouthing me off. I look forward to it.
It's great content generation from other channels to do the response videos. So if I remember correctly, this was your second debate. So is that true? So eventually we'll have to get a third one to complete the Fro versus TurretinFan trilogy. You can't just stop at 2 for anything. Can't stop at 2 movies of a series, 2 seasons, 2 debates. You got to at least complete the trilogy. So we'll have to discuss what could be a good third debate topic. So, all right, Fro, TurretinFan, great stuff to the audience. I want to encourage you to please check the description box of this video and show our guests here tonight, Fro and TurretinFan, some love by giving them a subscription. And whether you disagree or agree with them, they are both always up for some interaction. And that's good. I appreciate that. Debates are important because, as I like to say, they get us out of our theological echo chambers. They bring us into the debate coliseum to discuss these important issues. God bless you all. Standing for Truth is signing off.